There is a rhythm in Genesis that is almost impossible to miss once you hear it. A man is born, he grows old, he fathers sons and daughters. His years are counted, and then the same sentence returns. He died. Another generation follows. He lived, he fathered children, he grew old, and he died. Again and again and again. Genesis chapter 5 reads almost like the slow tolling of a bell over the first generations of humanity. Adam the man, formed from the dust, lived 930 years and died. Seth lived 912 years and died. Enoch lived 905 years and died. Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared. The numbers change, the names change, but the ending does not. Death has entered the human story, and Genesis refuses to let the reader forget it. Then the genealogy reaches one man, and suddenly the pattern breaks. His name is Enoch. Genesis tells us that Enoch lived 65 years and became the father of Methuselah. After that, something is said about him that the genealogy has not said about the men immediately before him. Enoch walked with God. The text repeats the idea. And then, at the moment when the reader has been trained to expect the familiar ending, when we expect to hear that Enoch lived so many years, completed his life, and died, the sentence changes. Enoch was no more. God took him. No grave is described, no illness is mentioned, no final words are recorded, there is no funeral. Genesis does not tell us that Enoch fought a great battle, ruled a kingdom, divided a sea, built a temple, confronted an empire, or gathered thousands of followers. It barely tells us anything about him at all. And yet this man, described in only a handful of verses, would become one of the most mysterious figures in the entire biblical story. Centuries later, the New Testament returns to him. Hebrews does not treat his disappearance as an ordinary death. It says that by faith, Enoch was taken so that he would not experience death, and that before he was taken, he was known as one who pleased God. Then another New Testament book does something even more surprising. Jude identifies him as Enoch, the seventh from Adam, and associates him with a proclamation of divine judgment against ungodliness. 3 brief windows: Genesis, Hebrews, Jude, and around those few biblical statements, centuries of questions would grow. Where did Enoch go? What does it actually mean that God took him? Why did Enoch escape the pattern of death that dominates Genesis chapter 5? What did it mean for a man living generations before Noah to walk with God? Did Enoch see heaven? Did he receive visions of angels and judgment? Did he write the ancient work now known as the Book of Enoch? And perhaps most importantly, how much of what people believe about Enoch actually comes from the Bible, and how much comes from traditions that developed long afterward? Those questions matter because Enoch is one of the easiest biblical figures to turn into someone Scripture never describes. The mystery surrounding him is real, but mystery creates temptation. When a text says little, later generations often want to say more, and Enoch left one of the largest silences in Genesis. To understand him, we have to resist the urge to begin with the legends. We have to begin where Genesis begins, not in heaven, not among angels, not with the Watchers, not with secret books, but with a family, and with a world that had already begun to change. The story of Enoch belongs to the earliest chapters of Genesis after humanity has been driven from Eden, but before the flood covers the earth. Adam and Eve have lost the garden. Cain has killed Abel. Human beings are multiplying. Families are forming. Settlements are appearing. Skills are developing. Music, livestock keeping, metalworking, and organized human society begin appearing in the narrative. But so does something else: violence. Cain's murder of Abel is not presented as the final act of bloodshed. It becomes the beginning of a pattern. By the later part of Genesis chapter 4, another man named Lamech boasts that he has killed a man who wounded him. The language of vengeance has expanded. Cain once feared being killed and received a mark of protection. Lamech speaks as though vengeance itself has become something to celebrate. Human civilization is advancing. Human violence is advancing with it. And somewhere inside this ancient world, Enoch lives. But before we reach the Enoch who walked with God, Genesis introduces another detail that many readers pass over completely. There is not just one Enoch in these chapters, there are two. Before Genesis chapter 5 introduces Enoch, the son of Jared, Genesis chapter 4 has already introduced a man with exactly the same name. That first Enoch is the son of Cain. After Cain kills Abel and leaves the presence of the Lord, Genesis tells us that Cain and his wife have a son named Enoch. Cain then builds a city and names it after his son. So before the Bible ever tells us about a man named Enoch walking with God, it has already shown us another Enoch connected with the family of Cain and with one of the earliest cities mentioned in Scripture. Two men, the same name, two genealogical lines, and two very different narrative settings. That distinction is essential. The Enoch who was taken by God was not Cain's son. He came from another line, the line traced through Adam's son, Seth. Genesis makes this clear by constructing two genealogical sequences in neighboring chapters. One follows Cain, the other eventually follows Seth. And the differences between these accounts become important, not because Genesis gives us permission to label every individual in one family wicked and every individual in the other righteous, but because the author places the two lines beside one another while the larger human story moves steadily toward the crisis of the flood. To see why that matters, we have to return to Adam and Eve. After Abel's murder and Cain's departure, the family at the center of Genesis has suffered a devastating fracture. One son is dead, another has gone away. Then Eve gives birth to Seth. The text presents Seth as another offspring in place of Abel. Seth later has a son named Enoch, and near the end of Genesis chapter 4 comes a brief statement whose significance is easy to overlook. At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Genesis does not stop to explain every detail of what this means. But something is continuing. Outside Eden, after murder, exile, and loss, humanity has not become completely disconnected from God. There are still people calling upon His name. There are still generations in which the knowledge of God continues. Then, Genesis chapter 5 begins almost as though the story is taking a deliberate step backward. This is the book of the generations of Adam. The narrative returns to humanity's beginning. God created mankind. Adam fathered a son in his likeness. That son was Seth. Seth fathered Enoch. Enoch fathered Kenan. Kenan fathered Mahalalel. Mahalalel fathered Jared, and Jared became the father of Enoch. This Enoch is not an isolated mystical stranger who suddenly appears out of nowhere. He is part of a family line. He has ancestors. He will have descendants. And one of those descendants will become one of the most famous figures in Genesis, Noah. The line runs from Adam through Seth and eventually through Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah. That means Enoch stands in a remarkable position in the biblical timeline. Behind him lies Eden, the fall, Cain and Abel, and the first generations born into a world under the shadow of death. Ahead of him lies Noah, the corruption of the earth, divine judgment, the ark, and the flood. Enoch lives between the lost garden and the coming waters, and Genesis tells us almost nothing about the events of his daily life. No childhood story, no dramatic calling scene. No account of his marriage, no description of his appearance, no occupation, no journey, no recorded conversation between Enoch and God, no explanation of when he first began to walk with God. Instead, Genesis gives us numbers, names, relationships, and one extraordinary description: Enoch walked with God. That phrase becomes more striking when we notice the structure surrounding it. Genesis 5 is not simply giving us a list of ancestors. It is forcing us to confront something introduced much earlier in the story. God had warned Adam that rebellion would bring death. Then Adam sinned. He was expelled from Eden. He lived for centuries, and finally Genesis records the outcome. He died. The next generation dies, then the next. The extraordinary lifespans may feel strange to a modern reader, but within the literary rhythm of the chapter, even 900 years cannot defeat the same enemy. The numbers are enormous. The ending is identical. Death wins every time. Until Enoch. Jared, Enoch's father, lives 962 years. His life is far longer than Enoch's, but Jared dies. Enoch's life, by comparison, is strikingly short. 365 years. In Genesis 5, that is not impressive longevity. It is the opposite. Compared with the men around him, Enoch disappears astonishingly early. Yet Genesis does not treat those missing centuries as a tragedy. It treats his ending as something unique. Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more, because God took him. The chapter immediately continues. Methuselah lives. He fathers Lamech. He dies. Lamech fathers Noah. He dies. The ancient rhythm resumes. It is as though Genesis opens one narrow doorway in the middle of a long corridor of graves and then closes it again. For one man, the expected sentence never comes. That alone would have been enough to make Enoch unforgettable. But there is another detail hidden in the genealogy. Enoch does not simply appear in the family line. He occupies a particular position within it. Count the generations beginning with Adam. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch. 7. This detail will matter much later because Jude deliberately identifies him as the seventh from Adam. Jude's wording does more than name Enoch. It distinguishes him. The New Testament writer knows exactly which Enoch he means, not the Enoch in Cain's line, the seventh from Adam in the genealogy traced through Seth. This matters because the earliest chapters of Genesis contain names that can easily blur together. There are two Enochs. There are also two men named Lamech, one in Cain's genealogy and another in the genealogy that leads to Noah. The resemblance between the names is one reason careless retellings can quickly become confused. But Genesis keeps the lines distinct. Cain's genealogy introduces Enoch, then Irad, Mehujael, Methuselah, and Lamech. Seth's line runs through Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah. And if we place these two genealogical accounts beside each other, an intriguing contrast begins to emerge. Cain's line includes the building of a city. It includes cultural development. It includes livestock keeping, music, and metalworking. It also culminates in the portion Genesis chooses to emphasize, with Lamech's violent boast. Seth's line, meanwhile, brings the reader repeatedly face to face with mortality, and in the middle of that procession toward death appears Enoch, the man who walked with God. We should be careful here. The Bible does not tell us that everyone in Cain's line rejected God. It does not tell us that every person descended through Seth was personally righteous. Later biblical history repeatedly warns against making righteousness a matter of biological ancestry. So the point cannot simply be reduced to one good bloodline and one evil bloodline. Genesis is doing something more subtle. It is showing human life unfolding outside Eden. People build, they marry, they raise children, they make tools, they create music, they establish communities, they struggle with violence, they die. And among these generations, certain individuals are described in ways that force us to stop. Enoch is one of them. His greatness, if we can call it that, is not measured by the usual standards of ancient power. Genesis never calls him a king. It never says he commanded an army. It never mentions land he conquered. The only city named after an Enoch belongs to the story of the other Enoch, the son of Cain. The Enoch of Genesis 5 leaves behind no city bearing his name in the biblical account. Instead, he leaves behind a sentence: he walked with God. That is an astonishing contrast. One Enoch is associated with a city built and named in his honor. The other is associated with a relationship with God. One appears in Cain's line near the beginning of human settlement. The other appears in Seth's line, inside a genealogy dominated by death. And it is the second Enoch whose story refuses to end in the expected way. This is where the untold story begins, not with an answer, with a disruption. If we approach Enoch only through later legends, we risk missing what Genesis itself has carefully constructed around him. His story is strange precisely because it is so restrained. The Bible could have given us chapters about his experiences. It does not. It could have described the moment God took him. It does not. It could have told us where he went. It does not. Instead, Scripture gives us just enough information to make the silence impossible to ignore. Enoch lived. Enoch fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God. Enoch disappeared because God took him. And generations later, Hebrews would look back at that ancient sentence and identify the principle beneath it: faith. Before he was taken, Enoch had the testimony that he pleased God. Hebrews then immediately turns from Enoch's life to a broader declaration: without faith, it is impossible to please God. That means the New Testament does not preserve Enoch merely as a curiosity. He is not introduced in Hebrews as the man who possessed hidden knowledge. He is not praised there for understanding angels. He is not remembered first for cosmic secrets. He is remembered for faith. That distinction will become essential when we eventually reach the traditions that grew around his name. But first, there is a more basic question. What would it have meant for Enoch to walk with God in the world described by Genesis? The phrase sounds familiar to modern believers because it has become part of Christian vocabulary. We speak about walking with God as a description of spiritual life. But Genesis uses the language sparingly, and Enoch is not the only man associated with it. Several generations later, when the earth has moved closer to the catastrophe of the flood, another man will be described in remarkably similar language: Noah. That connection is not accidental to the flow of Genesis. Enoch stands in Noah's ancestral line. Enoch walks with God before the flood generation reaches its crisis. Then, Noah, Enoch's great-grandson, will also be described as a man who walked with God as judgment approaches. The genealogy is beginning to reveal that Enoch is not simply a strange interruption in a list of names. He may be a key to understanding what faithfulness looks like in the earliest world of Genesis. And that brings us back to the two men who carried the same name. One Enoch belonged to the line of Cain. His father built a city and gave that city his son's name. The other Enoch belonged to the line that would lead to Noah. No city preserves his fame in the biblical account. His monument is something far more difficult to build: a life described as walking with God. Two Enochs, two genealogies, two very different memories. And once we understand why Genesis places these family lines where it does, the famous disappearance of Enoch begins to look less like an isolated supernatural mystery and more like the climax of a much deeper contrast that has been developing since humanity left Eden. Because before we can understand why God took Enoch, we first have to understand the world Enoch was walking through. To understand Enoch, we have to understand the world that came before him. Not the world before creation, not even the world inside Eden, but the world after Eden, the world humanity was forced to build once the garden was closed behind them. Genesis does not describe that world as empty. Life continued, Children were born. Families expanded. People learned to work the soil, tend animals, shape metal, make music, and build settlements. Civilization did not stop after the fall. In some ways, it accelerated. But Genesis places every achievement beneath a shadow. Human beings could build cities, but they could not rebuild Eden. They could develop tools, but they could not repair the broken relationship between humanity and God by skill alone. They could produce music, wealth, and culture, but none of those things could reverse the sentence that now hung over every generation. Death remained, and violence was growing. The first human death recorded in Scripture was not the peaceful death of an old man. It was murder. Cain rose against his brother Abel and killed him. That act transformed the first family. Adam and Eve did not merely lose Abel. They also lost Cain in another sense, because Cain left the place where his parents lived and became a wanderer under judgment. Yet even Cain's story did not end a wasteland. Genesis says that Cain had a son, and that son's name was Enoch. Cain then built a city and called the city by the name of his son. This is the first Enoch, and his existence creates a problem for anyone who reads too quickly. Because when Genesis later introduces the Enoch who walked with God, the name is already familiar. The two men are not the same. They belong to different genealogies. They have different fathers, and Genesis remembers them for very different reasons. The first Enoch is the son of Cain. The second Enoch is the son of Jared. The first is introduced in connection with the city built by Cain. The second is introduced in connection with an extraordinary relationship with God. This contrast becomes even more interesting when we examine the generations that surround them. Cain's descendants are described in Genesis 4 through a series of names and developments. Cain fathers Enoch. Enoch's line continues through Irad, Mehujael, Methuselah, and Lamech. Then the genealogy slows down. Instead of simply moving to the next name, Genesis begins telling us more about Lamech's household. Lamech takes two wives, Ada and Zillah. Their children become associated with major developments in early human society. Jabal is linked with those who live in tents and raise livestock. Jubal is associated with musical instruments. Tubal-Cain is described as a worker of bronze and iron. The picture is striking. This is a world becoming more organized, more skilled, more technically capable. Human beings are adapting to life outside Eden. They are learning how to cultivate produce, to create and shape their environment. Genesis does not say these skills are evil. The text simply records them. But then right in the middle of these signs of development, another form of development appears. Violence has developed too. Lamech speaks to his wives and boasts about killing a man for wounding him. Cain had killed his brother and then feared retaliation. Lamech now speaks of retaliation as something multiplied beyond measure. The language has changed. The violence has intensified. The human world is becoming more capable while also becoming more dangerous. This is one of the great tensions of Genesis before the flood. Progress does not automatically produce righteousness. Civilization can grow while the human heart remains disordered. That matters when we come to Enoch, because the Bible does not place him in a peaceful, untouched world. He belongs to a humanity already carrying the consequences of rebellion. He lives in an age when people are building something beyond Eden, but not necessarily returning to God. Then Genesis turns to another family line. After the death of Abel, Eve gives birth to Seth. She recognizes Seth as another offspring given in Abel's place. Seth then fathers Enoch, and the chapter ends with the statement that people began to call upon the name of the Lord. That brief sentence does not give us a complete history of worship. It does not tell us exactly how organized worship functioned at this time. It does not describe temples, priests, or written liturgies. Those structures belong to much later parts of the biblical story. But the statement matters. Humanity has left Eden, yet God has not disappeared from human memory. People call upon his name. Then, Genesis chapter 5 begins with a genealogy traced through Seth. The transition is important. Genesis is no longer following Cain's descendants. It returns to Adam and then proceeds through another line. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah. At first, the genealogy can feel repetitive, but repetition is doing important work. Each generation is tied to the one before it. Humanity survives, the family expands. The promise that human life will continue has not vanished. Yet every generation also carries the same mortality. Adam dies, Seth dies, Enosh dies, Kenan dies, Mahalalel dies, Jared dies. The reader is being trained to expect death. And before Enoch breaks that pattern, Genesis gives us a second pattern that is easier to miss. Names from the two genealogies resemble one another. There is Enoch in Cain's line. There is Enoch in Seth's line. There is a Lamech in Cain's line. There is another Lamech in the line leading to Noah. There are other names that sound similar enough that readers sometimes assume the two genealogies are describing the same family in different forms. But the narrative itself distinguishes them through their father's descendants and contexts. That means we should not flatten the two genealogies into one. Nor should we force the contrast beyond what Genesis actually says. It is tempting to describe Cain's line as entirely evil and Seth's line as entirely righteous. But Scripture does not give us enough information to make that judgment about every person listed. The contrast is more literary and theological than biological. Genesis is showing two streams of human history developing outside Eden. One line begins with Cain, the man who murdered his brother and departed under judgment. The other line is traced through Seth, the son born after Abel's death. Both lines contain families. Both lines contain people who live ordinary human lives. But the narrative draws attention to different features. Cain's genealogy emphasizes the rise of city life, craftsmanship, music, livestock culture, and eventually Lamech's violence. Seth's genealogy emphasizes generation after generation passing beneath the power of death. And then, one man in Seth's line refuses to fit the expected ending. Enoch. The second Enoch, the son of Jared, the father of Methuselah, the seventh generation from Adam through this genealogy. Before anything supernatural happens to him, his place in the family already matters. Jared lives an extraordinarily long life. At the age of 162, he fathers Enoch. Enoch grows up. Genesis says that at 65, Enoch fathers Methuselah. Then the text tells us that after Methuselah's birth, Enoch walks with God for 300 years and fathers other sons and daughters. That detail is easy to overlook. Enoch was not described as a man who disappeared from ordinary human responsibilities. He had a family. He had children. His life included generations after him. Whatever walking with God meant, Genesis does not present it as withdrawal from all human relationships. Enoch's spiritual distinction existed within a family line. He lived as a father. He became an ancestor. And one of his descendants would eventually carry the human family through the flood. Methuselah, Enoch's son, becomes one of the most famous names in biblical genealogy because Genesis gives him the longest lifespan recorded there. 969 years. Methuselah fathers Lamech. That Lamech is not the violent Lamech from Cain's line. He is another man entirely. And this second Lamech becomes the father of Noah. When Noah is born, Lamech gives him a name connected to hope. He says that Noah will bring relief from the painful toil caused by the ground the Lord had cursed. The words reach backward to Adam. The ground had been cursed after humanity's rebellion. Generations have now lived beneath that burden. Lamech looks at his newborn son and speaks as though perhaps this child will bring some form of rest. The reader knows something Lamech does not yet know. Noah will indeed become a turning point, but not in the way a comfortable family story might suggest. Before Noah can become associated with rescue, the earth will move toward judgment, violence will spread, human wickedness will become the central crisis, and the flood will divide the earliest biblical world into a before and an after. Enoch stands several generations before that catastrophe. This changes the atmosphere around his story. The Bible does not describe him as a man walking with God in an ideal age. His position in Genesis suggests something far more significant. Faithfulness is appearing in a world moving toward corruption. That makes Enoch's description sharper. Anyone can admire devotion when the surrounding world seems stable. Enoch's story asks a different question. What does it mean to walk with God when human society is moving in another direction? Genesis does not answer this through recorded sermons from Enoch. It does not preserve a detailed moral code from him. It does not give us a list of spiritual practices. Instead, it gives us the pattern of his life. 300 years after the birth of Methuselah, Enoch walks with God. That is not presented as a single dramatic encounter. The wording suggests continuity, a life, a path, a sustained relationship. And that is important because later traditions would remember Enoch for extraordinary revelations. But Genesis remembers him first for ordinary faithfulness stretched across centuries. Before the visions attributed to his name, before apocalyptic books, before later speculation about heaven, there is simply a man walking with God. And perhaps that is why Genesis gives us so little. The text is not trying to satisfy every question we might ask about Enoch. It is making a theological point inside the genealogy. Death has become normal. Walking with God has become extraordinary. Then Enoch's ending makes the contrast impossible to ignore. But we should not rush there yet, because even the phrase "walked with God" has a history within Genesis. Long before Enoch, the Bible has already used the image of walking in connection with God's presence. In Eden, God is described as moving through the garden. Adam and Eve hide from his presence after they sin. The relationship between God and humanity has been fractured. Human beings are driven east of Eden. The way back to the tree of life is guarded, and generations grow up outside the garden. In that setting, the statement that Enoch walked with God carries weight. The text does not say he returned to Eden. It does not say the curse had been removed. It does not say death had disappeared from the world. Enoch remained a descendant of Adam in a fallen creation. Yet within that broken world, communion with God was still possible. That is one of the hidden threads connecting the earliest chapters of Genesis. The garden is lost, but God has not become inaccessible in every sense. Cain can still speak with God. People can call upon the name of the Lord. Enoch can walk with God. Later, Noah can walk with God. The biblical story is already showing that exile from Eden is not the same thing as total abandonment by God. That distinction matters for everything that comes later. The story of the Bible will repeatedly feature human beings living outside ideal conditions. Abraham will wander without possessing the full land promised to him. Joseph will live faithfully in Egypt. Moses will encounter God in wilderness. Israel will learn to worship in a portable tabernacle. Daniel will remain faithful in exile. The location changes, the political world changes. But one question remains: can a human being walk faithfully with God in a world that is not Eden? Enoch is one of the earliest answers. Yes. And Genesis makes that answer even more powerful by placing him beside death. Look again at the genealogy. The chapter repeatedly describes how long each man lives after fathering a son. Then comes the total number of years, then the ending, and he died. The phrase is almost mechanical, but it is not meaningless. It is the echo of Genesis 3. Sin has consequences. The human family has not escaped them. When Enoch's record appears, everything seems ready to follow the same pattern. He fathers Methuselah. He has other sons and daughters. His total years are counted, 365. Then the expected words do not come. Instead, Genesis repeats the statement that he walked with God, and then says that he was not because God took him. The surprise only works because of everything that came before it. Without the genealogy, Enoch's ending is mysterious. Inside the genealogy, it is shocking. Death has been the refrain. Then one life ends without the refrain. This does not mean Genesis answers every theological question about what happened next. It does not. But it deliberately distinguishes Enoch's fate from that of the others. Centuries later, Hebrews will make the implication explicit. Enoch was taken so that he would not see death. That New Testament explanation gives us permission to say something strong. Enoch did not experience death in the ordinary way described for the other patriarchs in Genesis 5. But Hebrews also tells us what mattered before the extraordinary ending. Before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. The miracle comes after the life. The disappearance comes after the walk. That order matters. If we begin with the mystery, we may turn Enoch into a puzzle. If we begin with the genealogy, we see something else. Enoch is first a witness to what faithful life looked like between Eden and the flood. And the next great figure in this family will reinforce the pattern: Noah. When Genesis introduces Noah's righteousness, it will again say that a man walked with God. This phrase connects two men across generations: Enoch before the flood crisis fully unfolds, Noah when the crisis has reached its breaking point, ancestor and descendant. Two men remembered for walking with God while the world around them moved toward judgment. That connection raises an important possibility, not a secret doctrine, but a narrative observation. Perhaps Enoch's significance is not found only in the fact that he was taken. Perhaps Genesis has placed him in the genealogy as an early model of the kind of faithfulness that Noah will later embody. Enoch does not save the world from the flood. Noah will build the ark. Enoch does not receive the covenant after the waters recede. Noah will. But before Noah's story begins, the genealogy quietly establishes that one of his ancestors had already been known for walking with God. Faithfulness had a history in this family, and yet the Bible does not allow genealogy itself to become the source of righteousness. Noah's later generation will prove that being descended from faithful people is not enough. A family can inherit names, it can inherit memories, it can inherit stories, but every generation still faces its own relationship with God. This is why we must be careful not to turn Seth's genealogy into a mythology of perfect blood. Genesis itself eventually describes widespread human corruption. The descendants of Adam share the same human condition. What distinguishes Enoch is not merely who his ancestors were, it is how Scripture describes his life. He walked with God. That phrase is the center. The city does not define him. His lifespan does not define him. Even his famous disappearance is presented after the description of his walk. And that gives us a clue about how we should approach the mysteries that come later. Later generations would ask where Enoch went. Ancient writers would attach visions to his name. Traditions would expand his role. Readers would speculate about heaven, angels, judgment, and the end of the age. But Genesis asks us to look first at something simpler and more demanding. What kind of man was Enoch before God took him? The answer is only a few words long, and those few words may contain more meaning than all the legends that followed. Because walking with God was never merely about movement. It was about relationship, direction, faithfulness, and a life oriented toward God while the wider human story was moving toward death. But if that is what Genesis means, we need to understand the phrase more carefully. Why does Scripture use this language for Enoch? Why does Hebrews connect it with faith and pleasing God? And why does Genesis later use almost the same description for Noah? Before we can understand why Enoch was taken, we must first understand what made his walk so unusual. The most famous thing Genesis says about Enoch is also one of the shortest descriptions in the entire story. He walked with God. 4 words in English. But almost everything we understand about Enoch depends on what those words mean. If we treat them as a vague religious compliment, we miss the force of the passage. If we turn them into mystical language detached from Genesis, we also miss the point. The phrase has to be understood inside the world where Genesis places it. A world outside Eden. A world where death has become normal. A world where human culture is growing, but violence is growing with it. A world moving generation by generation toward the crisis of the flood. And in the middle of that world, Genesis does not tell us that Enoch merely believed that God existed. It says he walked with him. That language suggests more than a single moment of faith, more than one prayer, more than one supernatural encounter. It describes a pattern, a direction, a life lived in relationship with God over time. Genesis gives us one chronological clue that makes this especially important. Enoch becomes the father of Methuselah at the age of 65. Then, Genesis says that Enoch walked with God for 300 years after Methuselah was born. Whatever happened in Enoch's spiritual life, the text presents his walk with God as sustained across centuries. Not a sudden experience immediately before he disappeared. Not a final act at the end of his life. A long way of living. This distinction matters because later traditions would focus intensely on Enoch's extraordinary ending, his disappearance, his supposed heavenly journeys, his association with angels, his place in apocalyptic literature. But Genesis gives far more emphasis to the walk than to the mechanics of his removal. The text tells us what defined his life. Then it tells us what happened at its mysterious end. The order should shape our interpretation. Before Enoch was the man who was taken, he was the man who walked. And the Bible does not use that description casually. Several chapters later, Genesis will introduce Noah with strikingly similar language. Noah is described as a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and as one who walked with God. That connection gives us one of the strongest clues available. Enoch and Noah belong to the same family line. Both live in the generations before the flood. Both are singled out by Genesis, and both are associated with walking with God. Yet their stories are dramatically different. Enoch is taken away before the flood. Noah is preserved through the flood. Enoch leaves no recorded speeches in Genesis. Noah receives detailed instructions. Enoch's story occupies only a few verses. Noah's story fills chapters. But the same relationship stands behind both men. They walk with God. This suggests that Genesis is not using the phrase primarily to describe mystical travel. It is describing faithful life, a way of living before God. That interpretation becomes even stronger when the New Testament looks back at Enoch. Hebrews 11 does not explain the phrase walked with God by telling us about secret knowledge. Instead, it places Enoch inside its great discussion of faith. Hebrews begins with Abel, then Enoch, then Noah. The order is not accidental. These are figures from the earliest chapters of Genesis, and Hebrews is asking what their stories reveal about trusting God. Abel offers by faith. Enoch is taken by faith. Noah responds to God's warning by faith. And when Hebrews speaks specifically about Enoch, it says that before he was taken, he had the testimony that he pleased God. Then comes the principle, without faith it is impossible to please him. That means Hebrews interprets the mystery of Enoch through the category of faithfulness. What Genesis calls walking with God, Hebrews connects with pleasing God through faith. This does not tell us every detail of Enoch's spiritual life. It does not explain his daily practices. It does not provide a diary. But it gives us a theological center. Enoch trusted God. His life was oriented toward God. And Scripture remembers him because that faith shaped the way he lived. This becomes even more powerful when we remember the location of his story. Enoch does not live after the Exodus when Israel has the law of Moses. He does not live in Jerusalem with the temple standing at the center of national worship. He does not live during the age of the prophets. He does not possess the Psalms, the Gospels, or the letters of the New Testament. He belongs to the earliest biblical world, the world between Adam and Noah. The structures that later define Israel's worship have not yet appeared in the narrative. There is no tabernacle, no Levitical priesthood, no monarchy, no Jerusalem, no Sinai covenant. And yet, Genesis says Enoch walked with God. That statement tells us something important about the biblical idea of faith. Faithfulness to God begins long before the institutions that later shape Israel's national life. Enoch's relationship with God does not depend on possessing political power or religious office. Genesis does not call him priest. It does not call him prophet in its own account. It does not call him king. He is simply a man in the genealogy, a son, a father, an ancestor. And yet his relationship with God becomes the defining statement of his life. In a chapter dominated by how long people lived, Enoch is remembered for how he lived. That may be one of the most overlooked details in the entire passage. Genesis gives enormous ages. Adam, 930 years. Seth, 912. Enosh, 905. Jared, 962. Methuselah, 969. These numbers command attention. Modern readers naturally ask how to understand such extraordinary lifespans. But the literary point surrounding Enoch is almost ironic. He lives far fewer years than most of the patriarchs around him, only 365. And yet the shortest life in that immediate sequence receives the most unusual description. Genesis does not praise Enoch because he lived the longest. He did not. It remembers him because he walked with God. Longevity is not the measure. Relationship is. That contrast would have been difficult to miss for an ancient listener, hearing the genealogy read aloud. Year after year, generation after generation, long lives, many children, then death. And inside that rhythm, a man whose life is shorter, but whose description is deeper. There is also something important in the word walk. Walking is not usually a dramatic action. It is repeated movement, step after step, day after day. A path is formed over time. That makes the metaphor especially appropriate for faithfulness. A single step does not define a journey. Direction does. To say that Enoch walked with God suggests continuity rather than a single spectacular event. This is why we should be cautious about defining Enoch only by his disappearance. His ending was extraordinary. His life was sustained. And according to Genesis, the life came first. There is another biblical pattern worth noticing. Later scripture often uses the language of walking to describe conduct. People can walk in obedience, walk in wisdom, walk in righteousness, or walk in ways opposed to God. The metaphor carries the idea of a lived path, not merely what someone says, not merely what someone claims to believe. The direction of the life itself. Even without importing every later use of the metaphor back into Genesis, the broader biblical pattern helps us hear the force of the phrase. Enoch's walk was not simply geographical. It was relational and moral. His life moved with God rather than away from Him. And that is significant because the earliest chapters of Genesis are filled with movement away from God. Adam and Eve hide. They are expelled from Eden. Cain leaves the presence of the Lord and moves eastward. Human violence expands. The earth will eventually be described as corrupt. Against that movement, Enoch walks with God. Genesis does not say he found a road back into Eden. It gives us something more surprising. A human being could live outside Eden and still walk with the God of Eden. The garden remained closed, the curse remained, death remained, but relationship had not vanished. Enoch embodies that possibility. That is why the story is more than a strange report about one man escaping death. If all we ask is, where did Enoch go, we may overlook the question Genesis emphasizes first. How did Enoch live before he went? The answer is not elaborate. He walked with God. Hebrews adds, he pleased God. And faith explains the relationship. This may sound simple, but simplicity is not the same as insignificance. The earliest chapters of Genesis are establishing the largest questions in the Bible. What happens after humanity rebels? Can people still know God outside Eden? Will sin dominate every generation? Will death always have the final word? Can faithfulness survive in a world moving toward judgment? Enoch's life touches all of those questions, not by solving them completely, but by interrupting the expected pattern. He walks with God in a fallen world, and then death does not receive the usual final sentence. That connection between his life and his ending is critical. Genesis does not present Enoch's disappearance as a random divine act unrelated to his character. The text deliberately places the two statements together. Enoch walked with God. Then he was no more because God took him. Hebrews makes the relationship even clearer. By faith, Enoch was taken. Before he was taken, he was commended as pleasing God. The extraordinary ending is attached to a life of faith. But we should also be careful not to turn this into a formula. Genesis is not promising that everyone who walks faithfully with God will avoid physical death. The genealogy itself makes that impossible. Later scripture is filled with faithful people who die. Abraham dies, Moses dies, David dies, the prophets die, the apostles die. Even within Hebrews 11, many faithful people suffer and die without receiving extraordinary deliverance. So Enoch's story is exceptional. It cannot be turned into a universal rule. His faith is exemplary. His removal is unique. That difference matters. If we confuse example with promise, we force the text to say something it never says. Enoch teaches that faith pleases God. His particular escape from ordinary death demonstrates God's authority over death. But Scripture does not promise to repeat Enoch's exact experience for every faithful person. This is one reason Hebrews is so helpful. Hebrews honors Enoch without turning him into the pattern for everyone's physical fate. The chapter celebrates many forms of faithful response. Some are delivered. Some endure suffering. Some receive promises. Some die without seeing their fulfillment. Faithfulness does not guarantee identical circumstances. It means trusting God regardless of the path. Enoch's path happens to end in one of the most mysterious acts in Genesis. But before we reach that mystery, another question needs to be asked. What kind of world was Enoch actually walking through? Genesis 5 itself gives us mostly genealogy. It does not provide a detailed political or cultural history of Enoch's generation. We should not invent one. We do not know the names of rulers. We do not know what cities Enoch visited. We do not know what languages he spoke. We do not know the architecture of his home. We do not know his occupation. We do not know exactly what forms of worship he practiced. The text is silent, and that silence must be respected. But Genesis does give us the larger trajectory of the pre-flood world. The line of Cain has already shown violence escalating. Then, after the genealogy of Genesis 5, chapter 6 describes a world where human wickedness becomes severe and the earth is filled with violence. Enoch stands between those descriptions. We cannot assign every feature of Genesis 6 directly to Enoch's own lifetime without caution. The chronology spans generations, but we can say that Enoch belongs to the larger pre-flood world that Genesis portrays as moving toward moral collapse. That context makes the repeated phrase, "walked with God," even more meaningful. Faithfulness is not presented as an automatic product of the culture. Enoch's life stands out. Noah's life will stand out. When nearly everyone moves in one direction, Scripture notices those who move in another. And this creates another important contrast with Cain's first descendants. Cain fears judgment after killing Abel. He receives protection from God. Then he goes out and builds. His descendants develop important features of civilization. But the narrative eventually highlights Lamech's boast of violence. The question Genesis raises is not whether civilization itself is wrong. The deeper question is whether human development can heal the human heart. The answer appears to be no. Humans can shape metal without shaping themselves into righteousness. They can make music without restoring harmony with God. They can build cities without rebuilding Eden. They can increase power without increasing goodness. Enoch's distinction lies somewhere else entirely. He walks with God. No building is named after him in Genesis. No invention is credited to him. No monument is described. Yet his memory survives. And it survives not because of what he built, but because of whom he walked with. That contrast gives his story a remarkable timelessness. Every age measures human greatness differently. Cities, wealth, military strength, political influence, knowledge, technology, art, longevity, legacy. Genesis knows all of these things have value within human life. But when it reaches Enoch, the defining measure is different: relationship with God. The man with the shorter life receives the extraordinary testimony. The man without a recorded city becomes unforgettable. The man without a recorded throne becomes one of the few people in Scripture whose departure from this world breaks the ordinary pattern of death. And that brings us to the phrase Hebrews uses: he pleased God. For many readers, the words "walked with God" may sound poetic. Hebrews turns them into something more precise. Enoch's life pleased God because it was characterized by faith. Then Hebrews explains what faith requires. The person who comes to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. That statement helps us understand Enoch without inventing details. We do not need an imaginary biography. We know the essential thing. Enoch sought God, trusted God, and lived in a way that received divine approval. It is worth noticing what Hebrews does not emphasize. It does not say by secret knowledge Enoch was taken. By understanding angels Enoch was taken. By decoding heavenly mysteries Enoch was taken. By mastering hidden calendars Enoch was taken. It says by faith. Later writings associated with Enoch would become deeply interested in cosmic mysteries, but the canonical New Testament points the reader back to faith. That provides an interpretive boundary. Whatever else later traditions may say, The Enoch of Scripture cannot be separated from this basic identity. He is a man of faith. This becomes especially important when we eventually examine the book of Enoch. If we begin with later literature and then read Genesis through it, we may transform Enoch into a heavenly visionary first and a faithful man second.
Genesis and Hebrews reverse the order. Faith first, mystery second. And perhaps that is exactly why Enoch's story is so powerful. The Bible does not tell us enough to satisfy curiosity. It tells us enough to reveal character. We do not know what Enoch saw. We know how he walked. We do not know what heavenly realm, if any, he experienced in the language later traditions would describe. We know he pleased God. We do not know the mechanics of his disappearance. We know God took him. Scripture gives certainty where certainty matters most, and leaves mystery where it chooses to remain silent. But that silence did not remain empty in human imagination. For centuries, readers looked at the gap between Enoch walked with God and God took him, and wondered what could have happened. Some asked whether Enoch had been taken directly into heaven. Others connected him with revelations of judgment. Still others developed elaborate traditions about angels, heavenly places, calendars, cosmic order, and events preceding the flood. Those traditions did not appear without reason. Genesis had left an extraordinary opening. A man disappears. The Bible gives almost no description, and his position before the flood makes him an ideal figure around whom later writers could build stories of ancient revelation. But before we enter those traditions, we have to confront the most important biblical evidence about his disappearance itself. Genesis says God took him. Hebrews says he was taken so that he would not see death. That is stronger than simply saying his death was not recorded. The New Testament interprets his fate. Yet even with Hebrews, enormous questions remain. Where was he taken? What does not see death mean in relation to the larger biblical teaching about mortality? Was Enoch translated directly into God's presence? Is his experience comparable to Elijah's later departure? Does Enoch's story tell us anything about resurrection? Can it be connected with later Christian ideas about believers being caught up? And how far can we go before interpretation becomes speculation? Those questions cannot be answered by imagination. They have to begin with the exact claims the biblical text makes, and just as importantly, with the claims it refuses to make, because Enoch's mystery becomes most dangerous when silence is treated as evidence. If Scripture does not tell us where he went, we cannot create certainty by repeating a tradition often enough. If Scripture does not describe the mechanism, we cannot pretend a later reconstruction is the missing chapter of Genesis. If Scripture does not identify him with later prophetic figures, we cannot turn possibility into fact. The mystery is real, but responsible interpretation requires boundaries, and those boundaries make the next part of Enoch's story more fascinating, not less. Because Genesis does something extraordinary. It tells us God took a man. Hebrews does something even more extraordinary. It tells us why that statement means his story did not end in ordinary death. And then both writings stop, right at the place where our curiosity becomes strongest. Enoch walked with God. Enoch pleased God. Enoch lived by faith. And then Enoch was gone. The next question is unavoidable. What exactly does the Bible mean when it says God took him? Genesis does not describe the moment. There is no mountain, no chariot, no storm, no voice from heaven, no crowd watching, no final speech from Enoch, no farewell to Methuselah, no account of his family searching for him, no burial place, no body, no explanation of what anyone saw. The text simply says that Enoch walked with God, and then he was not, because God took him.
That may be one of the most dramatic examples in Scripture of how few words can create enormous mystery. The temptation is to rush immediately into the silence and fill it. But before asking where Enoch went, we have to ask what Genesis itself is doing. The key is the genealogy. By the time the reader reaches Enoch, Genesis chapter 5 has established an unmistakable pattern. Each generation is introduced. A son is born. More children follow. The total years are given. Then comes death. It happens to Adam. It happens to Seth. It happens to Enoch. It happens to Kenan. It happens to Mahalalel. It happens to Jared. The repetition is so strong that the reader knows what should come next. Enoch should die. But he does not receive the same formula. Instead, Genesis interrupts the rhythm. This means Enoch's ending is not merely vague, it is deliberately different. The text does not say that Enoch died at 365 years old. It says God took him. And later Scripture makes the implication even clearer. Hebrews 11:5 says that by faith Enoch was taken so that he would not see death. That statement gives us the strongest canonical explanation of Genesis 5. Whatever God took him means in every possible detail, Hebrews interprets it as an escape from ordinary death. This is important because some readers have suggested that perhaps Genesis simply uses unusual language for Enoch's death. Hebrews makes that difficult to maintain. The New Testament does not treat his story as a poetic way of saying he died. It contrasts his experience with death. Enoch was taken so that he would not see death. That is the clearest point we can affirm. But immediately after that clarity, the questions return. If Enoch did not die in the ordinary way, then where did he go? What happened to his body? What did taken involve? Was he transformed? Was he brought directly into heaven? Was his experience similar to Elijah's? Did he enter the final resurrection state before everyone else? Or was his situation unique in a way Scripture never fully explains? The Bible does not answer all of those questions, and that distinction is essential. There is a major difference between saying Scripture teaches that Enoch did not experience ordinary death and saying Scripture gives us a complete description of exactly what happened to Enoch after he disappeared. The first is supported by Hebrews, the second is not. Genesis gives us the event in compressed form. Hebrews gives us an interpretation of one aspect of the event. Neither text gives us a travel narrative. Neither describes heavenly geography. Neither tells us what Enoch saw. Neither tells us what Enoch did afterward. Neither tells us whether he spoke with angels. Neither says he received books from heaven. Neither says he returned to earth with secret knowledge. The mystery is real precisely because the biblical text stops where later curiosity begins. That is not an accident we are required to repair. Sometimes Scripture gives us enough to establish a truth without giving us enough to answer every question surrounding it. Enoch is one of the clearest examples. God's authority over human mortality is clear. The mechanics are not. Enoch's faith is clear. His post-earthly experience is not. His removal is clear. The destination is not described in Genesis 5. This is where careful reading matters more than dramatic imagination. Because once readers hear that Enoch did not die, the next step is often to picture him entering heaven exactly as later Christian art or tradition might portray it. But Genesis itself does not use that imagery. It says God took him. The Hebrew expression is brief. And within the context, the most important point is not the visual method, but the divine action. God is the subject. God took Enoch. Enoch did not discover a secret path. He did not escape mortality through wisdom. He did not ascend by his own power. The initiative belongs to God. That matters theologically. The genealogy is filled with human lives that cannot escape death. Age does not save them. Strength does not save them. Family legacy does not save them. Then Enoch's experience breaks the pattern, but only because God acts. The exception proves something about divine authority. Death may dominate the genealogy, but death is not sovereign over God. That is one of the deepest implications of the passage. Genesis 5 does not yet explain resurrection. It does not yet give the later biblical hope in developed form. But in Enoch, a crack appears in the apparent finality of death. The chapter teaches mortality by repetition. Then it teaches divine freedom by interruption. A man is taken. The ordinary ending does not occur, and the reader is left with the unsettling possibility that the pattern of death, however powerful, is not absolute. This does not mean Enoch's story is identical to resurrection. Resurrection means the dead are raised. Enoch, according to Hebrews, does not see death in the ordinary sense. That makes his case different. Nor should we automatically identify his experience with every later biblical event involving heavenly ascent. Each text needs to be read on its own terms. The closest Old Testament comparison is often Elijah. 2 Kings describes Elijah being taken up in a whirlwind as a chariot and horses of fire separate him from Elisha. That account is far more visual than Genesis 5. Elisha is present. The event is witnessed. The narrative describes Elijah's departure dramatically. Enoch's departure is almost the opposite. No spectacle is recorded. No observer is named. No vehicle is described. One man receives a scene, the other receives a sentence. Yet both stories share an important feature. Neither is given the ordinary death notice we might expect. This is why readers throughout history have naturally placed Enoch and Elijah together. They are the two most obvious biblical figures associated with extraordinary departure from ordinary earthly life. But even here, caution is necessary. Similarity is not identity. Scripture does not explicitly say that Enoch and Elijah experienced the exact same process. It does not tell us that they occupy the same role. It does not say that because both were taken, both must return in the same way. Those are conclusions people have drawn later. Some may be possible. They are not established by Genesis. One of the most popular later theories identifies Enoch and Elijah with the two witnesses of Revelation 11. The logic is easy to understand. If Enoch and Elijah did not experience ordinary death, then perhaps some readers argue they must return to die before the end. The theory is often connected with Hebrews 9:27, which says that it is appointed for people to die once, and after that comes judgment. From there, the argument goes, Enoch has not died. Elijah has not died. Therefore, they must be the two witnesses who will die in Revelation. But that conclusion goes beyond what Scripture directly states. Revelation 11 never names the two witnesses as Enoch and Elijah. Their imagery has strong connections with prophetic figures such as Moses and Elijah, but the text itself leaves them unnamed. And Hebrews 9:27 is a general statement about human mortality and judgment, not a rule requiring every biblical exception to be resolved by a later death. After all, Scripture itself contains people who were raised from the dead and later, presumably, died again, while those alive at Christ's return are described elsewhere in the New Testament in ways that complicate any attempt to force every individual into one mechanical sequence. So Enoch, as one of the two witnesses, remains a theory. Interesting. Historically influential, but not something we can present as fact. The same principle applies to other ideas. Some later traditions say Enoch was transformed into an angelic being. Others connect him with a figure known as Metatron in later Jewish mystical tradition. Those ideas belong to much later religious literature. Genesis does not say Enoch became an angel. Hebrews does not say Enoch became an angel. Jude does not say Enoch became an angel. Whatever importance those traditions have for understanding the history of interpretation, they cannot be inserted backward into Genesis as though they were part of the original account. This is where untold storytelling must remain disciplined. The goal is not to find the most elaborate tradition. The goal is to understand why the biblical text generated those traditions in the first place.
And the answer is becoming clearer. Genesis created an enormous interpretive space. A man does not receive a normal death notice. God takes him. No destination is described. No details are given. Then centuries pass. Readers continue asking, what happened? The silence becomes fertile ground. But before later literature fills that ground, Hebrews gives us one more essential insight. Enoch was taken by faith. That phrase is remarkable because it means his extraordinary ending cannot be separated from the defining quality of his life, faith. Hebrews does not simply say God arbitrarily removed Enoch. It places the event inside a chapter about trusting God. Enoch is one of a sequence. Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, and many others. Their circumstances are radically different. Their faith is the common thread. Enoch's uniqueness, therefore, does not isolate him from the rest of Scripture. It places him inside a larger biblical story of people who trusted God without possessing everything they hoped for in visible form. That is important because Enoch's mysterious ending can easily overshadow the message Hebrews wants to emphasize. The chapter is not called a catalog of supernatural disappearances. It is about faith. Enoch happens to be one of the most extraordinary examples, and Hebrews immediately explains what pleasing God requires. The one who comes to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. That language offers a window into Enoch's life without inventing scenes. Enoch sought God. The text does not tell us how his days were structured. It does not tell us where he prayed. It does not tell us whether he built altars. It does not tell us what revelations he received. But Hebrews allows us to say that his faith involved coming to God and trusting him. That is enough to explain why Enoch matters spiritually, but it still does not explain what taken looked like. And perhaps we should ask whether Scripture intends us to know. There are places in the Bible where the lack of detail is itself part of the message. When Moses dies, Deuteronomy tells us that no one knows his burial place. When Melchizedek appears in Genesis, the narrative gives almost no biographical information, and Hebrews later uses that literary silence in a theological argument. When Paul speaks of someone caught up to the third heaven, he refuses to build his authority around elaborate disclosure of the experience. Scripture often knows more than it chooses to tell. The Bible is not obligated to satisfy curiosity. Enoch is a powerful reminder of that. We know what God wanted preserved: a genealogy, a relationship, an extraordinary removal, a later testimony of faith. That is enough to establish significance. It is not enough to reconstruct the missing scene. Yet later readers were not content with silence, and perhaps that was inevitable. Imagine encountering Genesis before any later tradition about Enoch existed. You hear the genealogy read aloud. And he died, and he died, and he died. Then suddenly Enoch walked with God. Then he was no more, because God took him. Would you not ask where he went? Would you not wonder what he saw? Would you not ask whether he knew something others did not? Would you not wonder whether his closeness to God gave him access to mysteries of creation, judgment, or heaven? Those questions are natural. And in the centuries before the New Testament Jewish writers began giving them answers, they did not all produce the same answer, nor did all Jewish communities treat those traditions in the same way.
but the name Enoch became associated with a large body of apocalyptic material. This material presents Enoch not merely as a righteous ancestor, but as a visionary, a man who sees heavenly realities, a figure who receives explanations about angels, judgment, cosmic order, calendars, and events connected with the world before the flood. And this is where modern discussions of Enoch often become confused, because people speak of the book of Enoch as though Genesis once contained a lost chapter that was simply removed. That is not an accurate way to describe the evidence. The work, usually called First Enoch, is a collection of ancient Jewish writings associated with Enoch's name. It is not a missing chapter of Genesis. It was produced long after the lifetime the biblical genealogy assigns to Enoch. Its sections developed over time. Its traditions reflect concerns found in Jewish apocalyptic thought. And while it became highly influential in some circles, its relationship to the biblical canon varies across religious traditions. This does not make it worthless. Far from it. It can be extremely important for understanding the religious world surrounding parts of Second Temple Judaism and the background of certain New Testament language. But historical importance and canonical authority are not the same thing. A text can help us understand ancient interpretation without becoming the original biography of the biblical Enoch. That distinction will become crucial, because one of the biggest questions surrounding Enoch appears when we reach Jude. Jude does not merely mention Enoch. It contains wording closely related to material known from Enochic tradition. And that raises a question Christians have debated for centuries. If Jude uses Enochic material, does that mean the book of Enoch should be scripture? Before answering, we need to understand how ancient authors used sources. Biblical writers could refer to material known in their cultural environment without automatically declaring every part of the source inspired. Paul can quote Greek poets. The Old Testament can mention books or records that are not part of the canon. A biblical author can use a true statement, familiar saying, historical record, or literary tradition without making a blanket declaration about the status of everything associated with it. This principle will matter enormously when we examine Jude. But even before Jude, Enoch's connection with judgment has deep roots in ancient Jewish imagination. Why? Because of where he stands in Genesis. Enoch lives before Noah. Noah's world ends in judgment. Genesis 6 introduces one of the most debated passages in the Bible. The sons of God, the daughters of men, the Nephilim, increasing wickedness, and the coming flood. The canonical Genesis narrative does not make Enoch the interpreter of Genesis 6. It simply moves from Enoch's genealogy toward Noah and the flood. But later Jewish writers saw an opportunity. Who better to reveal the hidden meaning of the pre-flood world than a righteous man who lived before the flood and whom God mysteriously took? Enoch's biblical profile made him almost perfectly suited to become the voice of later apocalyptic tradition. He was ancient. He was righteous. He was connected genealogically to Noah. He did not die in the ordinary way. And Scripture already portrayed him as unusually close to God. Those few details provided a foundation on which later literature could build an enormous structure. This helps us understand why the legends became so expansive. The mystery was not created out of nothing. It grew around genuine biblical silence. But the growth must not be confused with the seed. The biblical seed is small. Enoch walked with God. He pleased God. He lived by faith. God took him. He did not see death. Jude identifies him as the seventh from Adam and connects him with a proclamation of judgment. That is the core. Everything beyond it must be classified carefully. This classification allows us to explore later traditions without either dismissing them or treating them as equal to Genesis. There is a middle path. We can ask what ancient Jewish readers believed. We can study why they connected Enoch with angels. We can examine how they interpreted the pre-flood world. We can understand why Jude's audience may have recognized Enochic language. But we must keep returning to the question, what does the canonical text actually say? That question protects the story from becoming a legend disguised as Bible. And it also makes the real biblical mystery more powerful. Because consider how extraordinary the certain facts already are. A man born generations after Adam lives in a world under the sentence of death. He becomes a father. He lives for centuries. Scripture says he walks with God. Then his life does not end with the formula used for the patriarchs around him. God takes him. The New Testament later confirms that he does not experience death in the ordinary way. That is already astonishing. We do not need to add a single angelic journey to make Enoch unique. We do not need secret chambers of heaven. We do not need forbidden revelations. We do not need conspiracy. The canonical story is mysterious enough, and its theological force is sharper because of its restraint. Death has entered Adam's family. The genealogy proves it. But God can interrupt death's pattern. Faithfulness still exists outside Eden. The story proves it. And human beings do not control the boundary between life and death. God does. Enoch's disappearance, therefore, does more than create curiosity. It quietly challenges the apparent inevitability that dominates Genesis 5. Every grave in the genealogy says, this is what happened after Adam. Enoch says this is not beyond God's authority. Yet his exceptional fate does not reverse the curse for humanity as a whole. The next names still die. Methuselah dies. Lamech dies. The flood comes. Human mortality continues. Enoch is a sign, not the complete solution. The biblical story still has far to go before death itself is confronted in its fullest theological sense. That fuller story will eventually move through promises, covenant sacrifice, prophets, resurrection, and the New Testament hope of final victory over death. We should not force all of that into Genesis 5, as though Enoch understood or embodied every later doctrine. But from the perspective of the whole canon, his story becomes one early witness to a truth that will grow clearer over time. Death is real, but it is not ultimate in the presence of God. For Genesis, that truth appears as an interruption. For Hebrews, it appears as an example of faith. For later readers, it became the doorway to much larger speculation. And that is where the story now takes a decisive turn. Because the Bible's silence about what Enoch saw did not remain silent in later literature. Ancient writers began to describe the missing world in extraordinary detail. They told of rebellious heavenly beings. They described judgment. They spoke of giants. They portrayed Enoch traveling through realms hidden from ordinary human sight. They connected his name with secrets of heaven and earth. And eventually, those traditions became associated with one of the most famous non-canonical works ever connected to a biblical figure, the Book of Enoch. But before we ask whether its stories are true, we need to ask a more basic question. What exactly is the Book of Enoch? And how did the quiet man of Genesis become the central figure of such an enormous tradition? By the time later Jewish writers began expanding the memory of Enoch, the biblical text had already given them almost everything needed to make him a natural figure for apocalyptic tradition. He lived before the flood. He belonged to the generations closest to the beginning of human history. He walked with God. He did not experience an ordinary death, and his descendant Noah would become the central human figure in the judgment that ended the pre-flood world. From only a few verses, Enoch already stood at the perfect intersection of mystery, judgment, ancient memory, and divine revelation. So later writers asked the questions Genesis did not answer.
What did Enoch see? Why was he taken? What did he learn about the world before the flood? Did he understand the corruption that would lead to judgment? Did he see heavenly beings? Did he receive knowledge about the structure of creation? Did God reveal to him what would happen to the wicked? Those questions eventually became attached to a large body of ancient Jewish literature, commonly known today as First Enoch, or the Book of Enoch. But the first thing we need to understand is simple. The Book of Enoch is not a missing chapter of Genesis. It is not a single manuscript written in one moment by the Enoch of Genesis and then quietly removed from every Bible. It is a collection of ancient Jewish writings that developed over time and were associated with Enoch's name. That distinction is essential. If we fail to make it, almost every discussion that follows becomes distorted. The name Book of Enoch makes the work sound like one unified ancient autobiography. In reality, First Enoch contains several major sections with different themes. These sections reflect a long process of composition and transmission. They are united by the figure of Enoch, but they do not read like a simple continuation of Genesis 5. They belong to the world of apocalyptic literature. That word apocalyptic does not simply mean about the end of the world. In ancient Jewish literature, apocalyptic writing often presents revelation through visions, angels, symbolic journeys, cosmic geography, heavenly records, judgment scenes, and explanations of realities hidden from ordinary human sight. The point is revelation. Something concealed is unveiled. Enoch became an ideal guide for that kind of literature. Why? Because Genesis had already told readers that God took him. Later writers could therefore imagine Enoch as someone who had crossed the boundary between the human world and heavenly mysteries. That does not mean Genesis itself tells us he did so. It means the biblical description made him an especially powerful literary figure for later authors. And one theme came to dominate many Enochic traditions: the crisis before the flood. This brings us to Genesis 6. Few passages in the early Bible have generated more debate. Genesis describes sons of God seeing that the daughters of humans were attractive and taking wives for themselves. The passage also mentions the Nephilim and then moves toward an assessment of escalating human wickedness. The earth heads toward judgment. The flood follows. Genesis gives only a compressed account. It does not stop to explain every identity or mechanism. Who exactly were the sons of God? How were the Nephilim related to the events described? How did this episode relate to the growing corruption of the earth? These questions became fertile ground for interpretation. One major ancient Jewish interpretation understood the sons of God as heavenly beings. In Enochic tradition, this idea expands dramatically. The beings are often called watchers. They descend. They take human women. They transgress divinely established boundaries, and their rebellion produces catastrophic consequences. In these traditions, the problem is not only sexual transgression. The watchers also transmit forbidden knowledge. Human beings receive teachings associated with warfare, enchantments, astrology, and other forms of knowledge portrayed as contributing to corruption. The world becomes disordered. Violence expands. Judgment becomes necessary. And Enoch is brought into the story as a righteous intermediary. He receives revelations. He witnesses heavenly realities. He announces judgment. He becomes a messenger between rebellious beings and God. This is a much larger role than Genesis gives him, and that fact must remain clear. Genesis never tells us Enoch confronted the watchers. Genesis never tells us Enoch traveled through the heavens. Genesis never tells us Enoch received the secrets of cosmic geography. Genesis never tells us Enoch was asked to intercede for fallen angels. Those are features of later Enochic literature. They may help us understand how some ancient Jewish readers interpreted Genesis 6.
They do not automatically tell us what Genesis 5 intended to say about the historical Enoch. This is where the distinction between biblical text and interpretive tradition becomes crucial. Ancient interpretation can be valuable. It can show us how people living closer to the cultural world of the New Testament wrestled with difficult passages.
It can explain imagery that appears in Jewish and Christian writings.
It can help us understand why certain themes, angels, judgment, imprisoned spirits, cosmic rebellion, were already familiar in some Jewish circles. But interpretation is still interpretation, even ancient interpretation. Age alone does not transform a later expansion into part of the original Genesis narrative. And yet it would be equally mistaken to dismiss the Book of Enoch as irrelevant.
It was not irrelevant. Its themes mattered. Its language circulated. Its ideas belonged to the religious world from which the New Testament emerged. And the clearest evidence of that connection appears in the letter of Jude. But before reaching Jude, we need to understand why the Book of Enoch became so closely associated with judgment. The answer begins with the biblical Enoch's position in history. He stands before the flood. That means later writers could place revelation about the flood in his mouth while still presenting the prophecy as ancient. Enoch becomes a witness before catastrophe. He can warn about judgment before Noah's generation experiences it. But apocalyptic literature rarely limits itself to one historical event. The flood becomes a model. Past judgment can point toward future judgment. The corruption of the pre-flood world becomes a pattern for later wickedness. Rebellious heavenly beings become examples of what happens when created beings reject divine order. And Enoch becomes the one who can look across these layers of history. That is why later Enochic material moves easily between the ancient world and expectations of future judgment. The Enoch character does not simply explain what happened before Noah. He becomes a voice announcing that God will judge evil again. This is the point where Jude becomes especially important, because Jude also writes about judgment. The letter warns against ungodly people. It uses examples from Israel's history. It refers to angels who did not remain within their proper position. It recalls Sodom and Gomorrah. It invokes images of rebellion and punishment. Then Jude introduces Enoch, not vaguely, not merely by name. He identifies him as the seventh from Adam. That phrase immediately takes us back to Genesis 5. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch. Jude is making sure the reader knows exactly which Enoch he means, the man in Seth's line, the man who walked with God. And Jude associates him with a declaration about the Lord coming with countless holy ones to execute judgment and expose ungodliness. The language is closely connected with Enochic tradition. This is the moment that often causes modern readers to jump to one of two extremes. The first extreme says, Jude quoted Enoch, therefore the entire book of Enoch must be inspired scripture. The second extreme says, if Jude uses material found in Enochic tradition, then either Jude is unreliable or the connection must be denied. Neither reaction is necessary. Ancient writers used sources. Biblical writers used sources. The presence of material from an outside tradition does not automatically canonize every word of the source. And using a known tradition does not automatically compromise the authority of the biblical writer. The key question is what Jude himself is affirming in the inspired text. Jude uses the Enoch tradition to support his warning about judgment. He is not giving his readers a table of contents and declaring the canonical status of every Enochic writing in circulation. This principle can be seen elsewhere in Scripture. Paul can quote pagan poets while preaching in Athens. The truth of the quoted line does not make the poet's entire body of work Scripture. Paul can use a familiar cultural statement because the statement serves his argument.
The Old Testament itself refers to writings that are not preserved as canonical books.
Biblical authors can draw from historical records, songs, sayings, genealogies, and known traditions. Citation and canonization are not the same act. This does not reduce the significance of Jude's use of Enochic material. It increases its historical significance. It shows that the traditions associated with Enoch were known enough to function in early Christian argument. Jude's readers could apparently recognize the image. The Enoch tradition had entered the intellectual environment of Second Temple Judaism deeply enough that it could be invoked in a Christian letter. That tells us something important. Enoch's later reputation was not a modern invention. Long before internet debates about forbidden books, Enoch had already become a major figure in Jewish apocalyptic imagination. His name carried associations with judgment, with ancient revelation, with the world before the flood, with heavenly beings, with cosmic order, and with the exposure of wickedness. This wider world can help modern readers understand some New Testament passages that otherwise feel abrupt. For example, references to rebellious angels or spirits connected with judgment did not emerge in a cultural vacuum. Jewish readers had already spent centuries interpreting the earliest chapters of Genesis and developing traditions around them. The New Testament sometimes enters conversations that were already underway, but that still does not mean every ancient interpretation receives biblical endorsement. The distinction remains, and maintaining that distinction protects us from a common mistake. When people discover the Book of Enoch for the first time, the experience can feel dramatic. They recognize names, they see Genesis-like material, they encounter angels, giants, judgment, and ancient patriarchs. Then they discover Jude's connection with Enochic language, and suddenly it can seem as though an entire hidden Bible has been found. But that conclusion moves far too quickly. A better question is, what kind of literature are we reading? When was it written? How does it use biblical characters? What role did it play in ancient Jewish thought? How was it received by different religious communities? And what does the canonical New Testament actually do with it? Those questions are less sensational, but they lead to better understanding. The history of First Enoch also reminds us that the biblical canon was not discussed in exactly the same way across every ancient community. Different Jewish and Christian traditions preserved different collections and gave different levels of authority to certain writings. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo tradition famously preserves First Enoch within its broader biblical canon. Most Jewish and Christian traditions do not include First Enoch in their standard Old Testament canon. This historical diversity matters, but it should not be turned into a conspiracy story. The existence of different canonical traditions is not evidence that one secret council simply removed Enoch to hide its teachings. The history is more complicated. Texts circulated differently, languages changed, communities used different collections. Some books were widely read without being treated as scripture everywhere. Others were preserved in specific traditions. The transmission of ancient religious literature is rarely explained by a single dramatic event. That is another reason the phrase "forbidden book" can be misleading. In some communities, Enoch was not forbidden, it was preserved. In others, it was known, but not included in the canon. In still others, parts of its traditions influenced interpretation, even where the book itself did not remain widely available. The story is one of reception, not simply suppression. And the manuscripts confirm that Enochic literature had an ancient life long before modern rediscovery. Fragments of Enochic works among the Dead Sea Scrolls show that these traditions circulated in Jewish communities before and around the time of the New Testament. This is historically important because it proves that Enoch was not only a later medieval curiosity. His writings belonged to the thought world of ancient Judaism. That background helps explain Jude. But again, manuscript age does not settle canonical authority.
An ancient text can be historically significant without being canonical for every community. This is the kind of distinction that Enoch forces readers to learn. Historical importance, literary influence, religious authority, canonical status, original biblical testimony, later interpretation. They are related categories. They are not identical. And once these categories are separated, something interesting happens. The biblical Enoch becomes clearer rather than smaller. He no longer has to carry every later tradition as though all of it were his biography. Instead, we can see two layers. The first layer is remarkably restrained. Genesis gives us Enoch the ancestor, the man who walks with God, the father of Methuselah, the man God takes. Hebrews gives us Enoch the example of faith, the man who pleases God, the man who does not see death. Jude gives us Enoch as a remembered ancient voice associated with judgment. That is the canonical portrait. The second layer is expansive. Enoch as visionary, Enoch as heavenly traveler, Enoch as interpreter of angelic rebellion, Enoch as recipient of cosmic knowledge, Enoch as apocalyptic messenger. That is the world of later Enochic tradition. The two layers interact, but they cannot simply be collapsed into one. And understanding why the second grew from the first tells us something profound about the power of biblical silence. Genesis gives later imagination a remarkable figure. A righteous man from the dawn of human history, a man who disappears without death, a man living before a catastrophic judgment. What better figure could ancient writers choose to carry revelations about the hidden causes of that judgment? This helps explain why the Watchers became so central. Genesis 6 is cryptic. Enochic literature provides a detailed interpretation. In that interpretation, heavenly rebellion and human violence become intertwined. The Watchers cross boundaries. Knowledge is corrupted. Giants devastate the earth. Bloodshed spreads. Creation itself cries out. Judgment comes. The structure answers questions Genesis leaves open, but it answers them through interpretation and expansion. This is why responsible Bible storytelling cannot simply say, the Bible tells us that 200 watchers descended on a mountain and taught humanity forbidden arts. Genesis does not tell us that. The book of Enoch does. Those are different claims. A careful narrator can say, one influential ancient Jewish interpretation preserved in 1st Enoch expanded Genesis 6 into a story of rebellious watchers who descended, took women, and transmitted forbidden knowledge. Now the audience understands the source. The tradition can be explored without being mislabeled. That distinction is not a small technical issue. It is the difference between teaching the Bible and rewriting it. Enoch's name is especially vulnerable to that confusion because the later stories are so much more detailed than the biblical ones. Detailed narratives often feel more concrete. Concrete stories are easier to remember. Soon a listener can begin remembering the later narrative as though Genesis itself had described it. That is exactly why we must keep returning to the text. Genesis never mentions watchers by name. Genesis does not tell us Enoch confronted them. Genesis does not describe Enoch traveling to a heavenly prison. Genesis does not give the elaborate angelic names found in later traditions. Genesis does not give Enoch astronomical revelation. These things belong to another literary layer, but they help us understand why Jude's use of Enoch is not random. Jude's letter operates in a world where these associations could carry meaning. When Jude speaks about angels who abandoned their proper place and then later invokes Enoch's prophecy of judgment, ancient readers familiar with Enochic traditions may have heard connections a modern reader easily misses. That does not require us to say Jude endorses every page of 1st Enoch. It means Jude speaks in a conceptual environment where Enoch was already linked with divine judgment against rebellion. And that brings us to the most difficult question of this entire section. If Jude attributes words to Enoch, did the historical Enoch actually speak them? There are several ways readers have approached this. Some accept that the historical Enoch gave such a prophecy, and that the tradition preserved a genuine ancient saying. Others understand Jude as citing a known literary tradition under the conventional attribution of Enoch. Still others emphasize that Jude's inspired use guarantees the truth of the statement as Jude uses it, without requiring certainty about the entire transmission history behind it. The biblical text itself does not give us enough information to reconstruct that transmission history with complete confidence, so we should resist pretending the uncertainty is resolved. What can we say? Jude deliberately presents Enoch as proclaiming judgment. Jude identifies him as the seventh from Adam. Jude's language has a strong relationship to Enochic tradition, and Jude uses that material as part of his authoritative warning against ungodliness. Those are secure observations. Whether the wording passed orally from the historical Enoch, entered later written tradition, or reflects another transmission process is not explained by Jude. That remains a historical question beyond what the letter itself settles. This is exactly the kind of place where untold storytelling should become more careful, not more dramatic. We do not need false certainty. The uncertainty itself reveals something important. Enoch's memory became a vessel. Across generations, his biblical identity as the man who walked with God and was taken became connected with a larger expectation that he possessed insight into divine judgment. By Jude's time, that association was strong enough to appear in Christian scripture, and now the hidden layer begins to change our view of Enoch. At the beginning, he seemed almost alone, a mysterious man in a genealogy. Now we can see the long shadow his brief biblical description cast over later centuries. Few verses created an enormous legacy. Few details created a library of interpretation. A short life by Genesis standards produced one of the longest afterlives in biblical imagination. And perhaps that should make us return to Genesis with even greater respect. Because the later traditions are loud, Genesis is quiet. The later literature gives Enoch journeys, visions, angels, speeches, and cosmic secrets. Genesis gives him one defining phrase: he walked with God. Maybe the contrast tells us something. Human curiosity wants to know what Enoch saw. Scripture first wants us to notice how Enoch lived. Human curiosity asks for the architecture of heaven. Genesis gives us faithfulness on earth. Human curiosity wants the secret behind his disappearance. Hebrews tells us that before he was taken, he pleased God. That does not make the later literature meaningless. It puts it in perspective. The Book of Enoch helps us understand the history of interpretation. Genesis tells us who Enoch is within the biblical story. Those are not the same task. And now one question remains before we can move forward. Jude did more than preserve Enoch's name. It brought an Enochic proclamation directly into the New Testament. So we need to examine that moment carefully. What exactly does Jude say? How closely does it connect with the Book of Enoch? Why does Jude use it? And does that quotation mean Christians should treat the entire Book of Enoch as scripture? The answer requires us to distinguish between a quotation, a tradition, and a canon. And once we do, one of the most misunderstood questions surrounding Enoch begins to become much clearer. By the time we reach the letter of Jude, Enoch has traveled an extraordinary distance through the history of interpretation. In Genesis, he is almost silent, a name in a genealogy, a father, a man who walks with God, a man whom God takes. In Hebrews, he becomes an example of faith, a man who pleases God, a man who does not see death. But in Jude, something new happens. Enoch speaks, or more precisely, Jude presents him as proclaiming judgment. And that brief moment has generated one of the most persistent questions surrounding the book of Enoch. If Jude quotes a tradition associated with Enoch, does that mean the entire book of Enoch should be treated as scripture? The question sounds simple. The answer is not. To understand it, we need to slow down and examine what Jude is actually doing. Jude is a short letter, but it is intense. Its purpose is not to give a biography of Enoch. It is not trying to explain Genesis 5. It is not presenting a history of ancient Jewish literature. Jude is confronting ungodliness. The letter warns about people who have entered the community and distorted grace into license. It reaches backward into biblical history for examples of rebellion and judgment. Israel in the wilderness. Angels who did not remain within their proper sphere, Sodom and Gomorrah, Cain, Balaam, Korah. The pattern is deliberate. Rebellion may take different forms, but divine judgment remains real. Then Jude reaches Enoch. The wording is striking. He identifies him as the seventh from Adam. That is more specific than necessary if Jude merely wanted to use a famous name. Why include the genealogy? Because there were multiple Enochs in the early chapters of Genesis. Jude removes ambiguity. He means the Enoch traced through Seth. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch. The man from Genesis 5, the man who walked with God. This alone creates an important connection. The Enoch of Jude is not an unrelated legendary figure who happens to share the same name. Jude deliberately links his statement to the biblical patriarch. Then comes the prophecy. Jude presents Enoch as announcing the coming of the Lord with myriads of holy ones to execute judgment and convict the ungodly. The theme fits Jude perfectly. Judgment, ungodliness, accountability, the certainty that rebellion will not continue forever. And the wording closely resembles material known from 1 Enoch. That connection cannot simply be ignored. Jude is using Enochic tradition. The real question is what that use means. There are several things it does not necessarily mean. It does not automatically mean Jude is declaring every section of 1 Enoch inspired. It does not automatically mean every Enochic story should be inserted into Genesis. It does not automatically prove that the surviving form of 1 Enoch reproduces word for word a book personally written by the historical Enoch. And it does not require Christians to pretend that all ancient communities treated 1 Enoch identically. Those are larger claims than Jude itself makes. What Jude unquestionably does is take a statement associated with Enoch and use it authoritatively inside his warning. That deserves attention. We should not weaken the significance just because the question of canon makes us uncomfortable. Jude does not appear embarrassed by the tradition. He uses it. But use and canonization are different categories. This distinction becomes easier to understand if we look at how Scripture uses other material. Paul, speaking in Athens, cites a line from a Greek poet. That does not make the entire poetic work part of Scripture. Elsewhere, Paul uses another saying from a pagan source. Again, the truth or usefulness of the quotation does not transfer divine authority to every sentence the original author ever wrote. The Old Testament refers to historical works that are not part of the standard biblical canon preserved today. Books of Chronicles, collections of Acts, poetic sources, records that biblical authors knew and used. A source can be real. A source can contain truth. A source can be cited. And yet the source as a whole does not automatically become canonical. This principle helps clarify Jude. Jude's inspired text includes the Enoch statement. Therefore, within Jude, the statement serves the inspired argument Jude is making. But that does not logically require the conclusion that every Enochic composition carries the same status. This is especially important Because First Enoch is not simply one uniform paragraph built around Jude's quotation. It is a large and complex collection. It contains different sections, different literary concerns, different layers of composition. Judgment appears repeatedly. So do angels, heavenly journeys, cosmic order, astronomical material, symbolic history, visions. The figure of Enoch functions as the unifying ancient authority around whom these revelations are organized. But Jude uses a particular proclamation for a particular purpose. That is a much narrower act than canonizing the entire collection. Still another question remains. If Jude presents the prophecy as Enoch's, should we believe the historical Enoch actually spoke it? This is where certainty becomes more difficult. Several possibilities have been proposed. One possibility is that a genuine ancient saying going back to Enoch was preserved through tradition and eventually included in Enochic literature. Another possibility is that Jude is using a literary tradition that speaks in Enoch's name, according to conventions already familiar in ancient Jewish writing. A third approach focuses less on reconstructing the full transmission history and more on Jude's own inspired use. Whatever the history behind the wording, Jude uses it truthfully as part of his argument. The text itself does not give us enough evidence to reconstruct every stage between the historical Enoch and the form of the tradition available in the Second Temple period. That means responsible interpretation has to acknowledge a limit. We know what Jude says. We know the wording is connected with Enochic tradition. We know Jude identifies the figure as the seventh from Adam. We know the prophecy serves a warning about judgment. We do not know with complete certainty how every word of that tradition traveled through the centuries. That uncertainty should not frighten us. It should discipline us. Because the goal is not to force the evidence to answer more than it can. Jude's use of Enoch is powerful even without an invented transmission history. In fact, the historical setting makes it more understandable. Jude writes in a world where Jewish readers already knew stories and interpretations that went beyond the brief wording of Genesis. The early chapters of Genesis had been discussed for generations. Who were the sons of God? What were the Nephilim? What did divine judgment mean? What happened to rebellious angels? What did the pre-flood patriarchs know? What did Enoch see? These were not new questions. By the time of the New Testament, they already had interpretive traditions around them. Jude enters that world. His audience would not necessarily hear the name Enoch as modern readers do. For many people today, Enoch means the mysterious man who never died. For ancient readers familiar with Enochic tradition, the name could also evoke judgment, angelic rebellion, ancient prophecy, the corruption of the pre-flood world, the coming punishment of the ungodly. That makes Jude's choice highly strategic. He is warning people who behave arrogantly toward divine order. So he reaches for a figure already associated with ancient judgment. Enoch becomes a witness against them. Not because Jude wants to satisfy curiosity about heaven, but because he wants to destroy false confidence. The ungodly may believe judgment is distant. Enoch's voice says it is coming. And the irony is powerful. Enoch lived before the flood, before Moses, before Israel, before the monarchy, before the prophets, before Jerusalem. Jude presents judgment as something announced from the earliest generations. In other words, divine accountability is not a late theological invention. It reaches back to the beginning of the human story. This fits the structure of Jude. He repeatedly uses old examples to confront present rebellion. The wilderness generation proves privilege does not prevent judgment. Rebellious angels prove status does not prevent judgment. Sodom proves social normality does not prevent judgment. Cain, Balaam, and Korah prove that self-will takes many forms. And Enoch's prophecy brings these examples under a single horizon. The Lord comes to judge. This also explains why the connection between Enoch and ungodliness matters. Jude repeats the idea of ungodliness with unusual force. The prophecy is not merely about spectacular cosmic rebellion, it is moral. Words, actions, defiance. The behavior of people who live as though God will never call them to account. This brings the Enoch tradition back down to earth. Whatever cosmic imagery later literature surrounds him with, Jude uses Enoch to speak about human conduct. That is another important boundary. Enoch is not merely a gateway into speculative angelology. In the canonical New Testament, his significance is ethical and theological. Genesis, he walks with God. Hebrews, he pleases God by faith. Jude, he stands as a voice announcing judgment against ungodliness. Put those three together, and a consistent portrait appears. Faithfulness, divine approval, judgment. That is far more coherent than the image of Enoch as merely an ancient collector of hidden secrets. And this may be one of the most important untold layers of his story. The later traditions make Enoch famous for what he knows. The canonical texts emphasize how he relates to God. That is a major difference. Genesis does not praise knowledge, Hebrews praises faith. Jude uses him to condemn ungodliness. The center is moral and relational before it is mysterious. This does not mean the ancient apocalyptic material is unimportant. It means its proper role is secondary. It helps us understand the world in which Jude could use Enoch so naturally, but it should not displace the simpler biblical portrait. There is another reason Jude's use of Enoch matters. It shows us that ancient biblical interpretation was not sealed off from surrounding literature. New Testament writers lived in a world of texts. They knew traditions, they knew stories, they knew common interpretive frameworks. When they wrote under inspiration, they did not stop being people situated in history. They could use known language and familiar material. This should not be surprising. God's revelation enters real human history. It uses real languages, real audiences, real cultural assumptions, real arguments. Jude's use of Enoch is one example of that process, and understanding it helps us avoid two mistakes. The first is fear. Some readers discover the Enoch connection and think something dangerous has been uncovered, as though the New Testament secretly depends on a forbidden book. But Jude's literary world was never forbidden to its first readers. Ancient Jewish literature was part of the environment. The second mistake is exaggeration. Other readers discover the connection and immediately conclude that First Enoch should control how we interpret Genesis, angels, Revelation, and the entire end-time story. That gives the source more authority than Jude himself demonstrably gives it. Both reactions come from collapsing categories. History is not canon. Influence is not inspiration. Quotation is not blanket endorsement. But neither is non-canonical status the same as uselessness. Once those categories are separated, the relationship becomes much clearer. First Enoch can illuminate Jude's cultural and interpretive background. Jude tells us how he wants to use the Enoch tradition. Genesis remains the foundational biblical narrative. Hebrews gives the canonical theological interpretation of Enoch's faith and escape from ordinary death. The texts can be read together without pretending they all have the same status. This becomes especially important when people ask whether the book of Enoch was removed from the Bible. That phrase creates an image of a once universal Bible containing Enoch until some authority suddenly took it away. The historical reality is more complicated. Different religious communities received and preserved collections differently. First Enoch remained especially important in Ethiopian Christianity and is included within the broader canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. Most Jewish traditions and most other Christian traditions did not ultimately include First Enoch within their canonical collection. Its transmission history was uneven. Parts of it survived in ancient manuscripts. Its complete form was preserved especially through the Ethiopic tradition. The question was not simply, when did everyone remove this book? There was no single universal moment in which every community possessed the exact same canon and then collectively deleted Enoch. The history is more diverse than that. This matters because conspiracy language distorts what is genuinely fascinating. We do not need a secret suppression story. The real history is already extraordinary. An ancient Jewish work associated with one of Genesis's most mysterious patriarchs circulated widely enough that fragments were preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Its imagery influenced the religious environment of the New Testament. Jude used Enochic tradition, and an ancient Christian tradition preserved First Enoch in full when it disappeared from widespread circulation elsewhere. That history deserves careful study. It does not need sensationalism. And perhaps this is another lesson Enoch teaches. The more mysterious a subject becomes, the more disciplined our language has to become, because mystery is where certainty is easiest to fake. A phrase like, "the church removed Enoch," sounds simple. History is not simple. A statement like, "Jude quotes Enoch, so the whole book is inspired," sounds decisive. The logic does not follow automatically. A claim like, "Enoch revealed exactly what happened in Genesis 6, sounds exciting. Genesis itself does not say that. Responsible interpretation does something harder. It preserves distinction. What is written? What is inferred? What is traditional? What is possible? What remains unknown? That method may feel less dramatic at first, but it actually makes the Enoch story more compelling, because the confirmed biblical material is already unlike almost anything else in Scripture. And now, after all this discussion of ancient literature, there is a danger of losing sight of the man himself. So we need to return to the genealogy, return to Jared, return to Methuselah, return to Lamech, return to Noah. Because Enoch is not merely the doorway into an apocalyptic library, he is part of a family story. And that family story keeps moving after he disappears. His son lives on. His grandson is born. Then his great-grandson Noah appears. The world continues toward the flood. This is where one of the most intriguing, overlooked aspects of Enoch emerges. What happened after he was taken? Not in heaven, on earth. His family remained. Methuselah remained. The generations continued. Enoch's extraordinary disappearance did not stop the human story. It did not prevent the coming corruption. It did not prevent judgment. Whatever his faith meant for him personally, his descendants still had to face the world themselves. That observation corrects another possible misunderstanding. One righteous ancestor cannot guarantee the faithfulness of future generations. Enoch walks with God, but eventually Genesis describes widespread corruption. The earth becomes filled with violence. Noah stands out as righteous in his generation. This means each generation must respond for itself. Spiritual legacy matters. But legacy is not automatic faith. Names can be inherited. Faith cannot be inherited in the same mechanical way. This is one reason the genealogy deserves closer attention. Enoch's position before Noah creates a line of continuity, but continuity does not mean simplicity. Methuselah becomes famous for longevity. Lamech speaks hope over Noah. Noah walks with God. And then the flood comes. The entire sequence forces us to think beyond Enoch's disappearance. His story is not only about how one man left the world. It is about what kind of world he left behind. That question takes us toward Genesis 6. Violence, corruption, judgment, the generation of Noah. And here the Enochic traditions become especially tempting because they offer detailed explanations of what Genesis leaves compressed. But our task is different. We need to follow what the biblical genealogy itself allows us to say. Enoch fathers Methuselah. Methuselah fathers Lamech. Lamech fathers Noah. Noah becomes the man through whom humanity survives the flood. That alone means Enoch occupies a major genealogical position. He is not a side character detached from the main biblical story. He stands directly in the line connecting Adam to Noah. And the phrase that defines Enoch will appear again with Noah. He walked with God. That repetition now becomes impossible to ignore. The grandfather's grandfather and the great-grandson. One disappears before judgment, one is preserved through judgment. Both are remembered for walking with God. The parallel does not require us to invent a secret prophecy passed down through the family. Genesis does not tell us that. It does not say Enoch personally warned Noah. It does not say Methuselah preserved Enoch's writings for him. Those ideas belong to later speculation, unless a source explicitly distinguishes them as tradition. But the literary connection is strong enough without invention. Enoch and Noah function as two lights inside the pre-flood genealogy. One shows that faithfulness is possible. The other will become the instrument of preservation when judgment finally arrives. And this leads to a more difficult question. How close was Enoch's life to the flood itself? Modern readers often see the names as separate episodes. Enoch, Methuselah, Noah. But genealogies compress centuries into a few lines. When the numbers are placed beside one another, family lives overlap across remarkable spans. This does not mean every chronological question is simple. Biblical genealogies and ancient chronologies can be interpreted in different ways depending on textual traditions and assumptions. But within the plain structure of Genesis 5, the generations are presented as deeply interconnected. Enoch does not belong to a forgotten prehistoric age completely detached from Noah. He belongs to Noah's immediate ancestral story. This is where Methuselah becomes especially interesting. The son of the man who did not receive the normal death formula becomes the man associated with the longest recorded lifespan in the genealogy. One life is unusually short by pre-flood standards. The other is extraordinarily long. Enoch lives 365 years. Methuselah lives 969. The contrast is striking. But Genesis does not explain it symbolically. We should be careful not to pretend it does. People have proposed meanings for the number 365. Some connect it with the solar year. Some see astronomical symbolism. Those suggestions may be interesting within later interpretive traditions, especially given the astronomical material associated with Enochic literature. But Genesis itself does not say Enoch lived 365 years because the number symbolizes the sun. That would be an inference, not a textual fact. The safest observation is simpler. Enoch's lifespan is unusually short compared with the surrounding patriarchs. And his life ends not with death, but with divine taking. The number intensifies his difference, it does not explain it. The same discipline applies to Methuselah's name. Popular claims sometimes say his name means something like, "When he dies, it shall be sent," linking his death directly to the timing of the flood. That interpretation is often presented confidently in sermons and online discussions. But the linguistic basis is debated, and Genesis itself never gives that explanation. We should not build the story on a meaning the text does not provide. What Genesis does provide is already enough. Methuselah is Enoch's son. He lives an extraordinary length of time. He fathers Lamech. Lamech fathers Noah. And Noah enters a world nearing catastrophe. The genealogy itself is the bridge. That bridge carries us from Enoch's faithfulness to Noah's crisis. And when we follow it, a hidden consequence appears. Enoch's story does not end when God takes him. Its impact continues through his descendants. Not because Genesis tells us they preserved secret revelations, but because the family line continues toward one of the defining events of biblical history, the flood. This may be the most important correction to the way Enoch is often discussed. People isolate him. They ask only, where did Enoch go? Genesis also invites another question. Where did Enoch's line go? It went to Noah. And Noah's story changes everything. The famous mystery of Enoch's disappearance can therefore distract us from a visible biblical connection sitting directly beneath it. He belongs to the road to the flood. That road will now take us out of later tradition and back into Genesis, back to Methuselah, back to Lamech, back to Noah, back to a world where corruption increases until divine judgment can no longer be delayed. And when we place Enoch inside that trajectory, his brief life begins to look different. He was not simply a man mysteriously removed from history. He stood in the middle of a history moving toward catastrophe. A man who walked with God before a generation would be described as filling the earth with violence. A father whose descendants would live into the age of Noah, an exception to death in a genealogy that would soon lead to judgment on almost all living humanity. And that raises the next overlooked question. What happens when we stop following Enoch upward into later heavenly traditions and instead follow his family forward toward the flood? When people speak about Enoch, they usually look upward. They ask where he went. They imagine heaven. They think about angels, visions, and the mysteries attached to his name. But Genesis itself points us in another direction, forward, toward his descendants, toward Methuselah, toward Lamech, toward Noah, toward the flood. This is one of the most overlooked parts of Enoch's story. He is not simply a mysterious man removed from the earth. He is part of a family line that carries the story from Adam directly into one of the greatest judgments in Genesis. And when we follow that line carefully, Enoch's place in the biblical narrative becomes clearer. Genesis tells us that Enoch became the father of Methuselah when he was 65 years old. Then Enoch walked with God for 300 years. He had other sons and daughters, and at the age of 365 he was taken by God. But Methuselah remained. The son continued after the father disappeared. And that detail matters. Enoch's extraordinary departure did not end the human story. It did not stop corruption. It did not prevent the world from moving toward judgment. It did not automatically make every generation after him faithful. The earth continued. Families multiplied. Violence increased. And eventually, Noah was born. This creates a powerful contrast. Enoch experienced an extraordinary personal deliverance, but the world itself is not yet delivered. One man is taken, the curse remains. One man escapes the normal pattern of death. Humanity continues living under mortality. One man walks with God. The generations after him still have to choose their own path. This distinction is essential. Faithfulness can leave a legacy. But faith cannot simply be inherited like a family name. Enoch could be the father of Methuselah. Methuselah could be the father of Lamech. Lamech could be the father of Noah. But each man still stood before God as an individual. Genesis does not tell us that righteousness passed automatically through blood. The genealogy gives continuity. It does not guarantee faithfulness. That is why Noah will later be singled out in his own generation. Genesis does not merely say that Noah came from Enoch's family. It describes Noah himself as righteous and as one who walked with God. The same phrase appears again. First Enoch, then Noah. The connection is difficult to ignore. Two men in the same family line, both living before the flood, both distinguished from the wider pattern around them, both described as walking with God. But their stories move in opposite directions. Enoch is taken out of the world before the great judgment arrives. Noah remains in the world and is preserved through that judgment. Enoch disappears, Noah builds. Enoch leaves behind almost no recorded action. Noah receives detailed instructions. Enoch's biblical account is brief. Noah's becomes one of the longest narratives in early Genesis. Yet the same phrase stands over them both. They walked with God. This may be one of the strongest literary links in the pre-flood story. Genesis does not tell us that Noah consciously modeled himself after Enoch. It does not describe Enoch's teachings being passed down generation after generation. It does not preserve a family scroll of Enochic wisdom. Those possibilities belong to speculation unless clearly identified as later tradition. But Genesis does place the two descriptions in the same family line, and that tells us something. Walking with God was possible before the flood. Enoch proved it. Walking with God was still possible when the world approached its darkest condition. Noah proved it again. The world changed. The standard did not. That becomes especially important when Genesis 6 describes the condition of humanity. The language becomes severe. Human wickedness is great. Violence fills the earth. Corruption spreads. The biblical story has traveled a long way from Eden. In the garden, humanity hides after one act of disobedience. Outside the garden, Cain kills Abel. Later, Lamech boasts of violence. By Noah's generation, violence is no longer merely an individual tragedy. It has become characteristic of the world Genesis describes. This is the direction of the narrative. Sin moves outward, from desire to rebellion, to murder, to vengeance, to widespread corruption. The fall was not an isolated event. Its consequences spread through generations. And that is the world toward which Enoch's family line is moving. This makes his life more significant. He does not walk with God because human history is improving. He walks with God while the wider biblical story is moving toward judgment. That is a very different picture from the romantic versions of Enoch that focus only on heavenly mysteries. The man of Genesis is important not because he escaped earthly reality. He is important because he was faithful within it. Then God took him. After Enoch, Methuselah lives for centuries. Genesis gives him 969 years, the longest lifespan recorded in the chapter. His name has become almost synonymous with extreme old age, but the Bible tells us very little else about him. This is another example of how later imagination can become larger than the actual text. Methuselah is famous, but Genesis does not give us a detailed biography. No speeches, no recorded acts of faith, no failures, no calling, no supernatural encounter. He is important primarily because of where he stands in the genealogy. Son of Enoch, father of Lamech, grandfather of Noah. He connects the man who was taken with the man who will survive the flood. That alone gives his life narrative importance. Popular interpretations sometimes claim that Methuselah's name predicted the flood, often giving it a meaning such as, "When he dies, it shall come." That claim is frequently repeated with great confidence, but Genesis itself never gives that interpretation. The proposed meaning of the name is debated. So, responsible storytelling should not use it as though Scripture explicitly predicts the flood through Methuselah's name. We do not need that claim. The genealogy already provides a stronger connection. Methuselah stands between Enoch and Noah. His life bridges two remarkable figures, one associated with escaping ordinary death, the other associated with surviving divine judgment. Then comes Lamech. Again, we have to remember there are two men named Lamech in the early Genesis narratives. The Lamech in Cain's line is remembered for a violent boast. The Lamech in Seth's genealogy is Noah's father. Same name, different man, different line, different narrative role. And when this second Lamech becomes a father, Genesis slows down enough to preserve his words. He names his son Noah, and he expresses hope. He says that this son will bring relief from the painful labor associated with the ground the Lord had cursed. The words reach all the way back to Adam. That matters. The genealogy is not merely moving forward. It is remembering backward. The curse on the ground has remained part of human existence for generations. Lamech looks at Noah and hopes for rest, relief, comfort, something different. He cannot yet know exactly how Noah's life will unfold. The reader, however, is moving toward the flood. And the irony is enormous. Noah will indeed become part of a new beginning, but that beginning will come through judgment. The world will not simply improve gradually. It will pass through water. The old order will be devastated. A family will survive. The earth will emerge into a new phase, and Noah will stand at the center. This means Enoch's genealogy is carrying more than family information. It is carrying the entire story toward crisis. Adam reminds us of creation and fall. Seth continues the line after Abel's death. Enoch introduces extraordinary faithfulness and extraordinary removal. Methuselah extends the genealogy across centuries. Lamech voices hope for relief from the curse. Noah becomes the man through whom humanity survives the flood. Seen this way, Genesis 5 is not a pause between interesting stories. It is a bridge. Without the genealogy, Adam and Noah would feel like disconnected episodes. With the genealogy, the reader sees continuity. The world of Noah is the world of Adam's descendants. The violence of Genesis 6 is the long consequence of the rebellion introduced in Genesis 3. The flood is not an unrelated disaster. It comes at the end of a developing moral history, and Enoch stands directly inside that history. This helps us understand why the words "walked with God" matter so much. The phrase does not float above the genealogy, it cuts through it. Death surrounds Enoch. Corruption approaches, yet his life takes another direction. Then Noah will be described in the same way when the crisis becomes unavoidable. 2 points of faithfulness, one before the darkest description of the world, one inside it. That does not mean everyone else in the genealogy was wicked. Genesis never says that. We should not create villains where the text gives only names. But it does mean the narrator deliberately singles out Enoch and Noah. Their relationship with God receives language other generations do not receive. And that distinction invites comparison. Enoch is taken. Noah is preserved. One does not pass through the coming catastrophe. The other does. This can tempt readers to create a prophetic system around the two men. Some have seen Enoch's removal as a symbolic preview of believers being taken before future judgment. Others compare Noah with those preserved through tribulation. These typological readings have appeared in different Christian interpretive traditions. But Genesis itself does not state such an end-times scheme. If someone wants to explore typology, it must be labeled as interpretation. It cannot be presented as the plain meaning of Enoch's story. The direct biblical point is more secure. God knows those who walk with him. He is sovereign over life and death. And divine judgment does not make faithfulness meaningless. Enoch's story demonstrates the first. Noah's story will demonstrate the second. There is also something striking about their positions relative to death. Enoch is remembered precisely because the usual death formula is missing. Noah's story, however, becomes surrounded by death on an enormous scale. In one family line, Genesis moves from one man not seeing death to a world where judgment brings death almost everywhere. That contrast is difficult to overstate. The genealogy is quietly preparing the reader for a theological shock. Enoch shows that God can take one righteous man beyond the normal human ending. The flood shows that God can also judge an entire corrupt world. Mercy and judgment are both present. But they are not random. The story repeatedly returns to human relationship with God. This is where the later Enochic traditions become both interesting and potentially distracting. Those traditions often attempt to explain the corruption before the flood through the Watcher's forbidden knowledge giants and heavenly rebellion. That is historically important. But canonical Genesis places extraordinary emphasis on human wickedness too. Whatever interpretation one gives the difficult opening verses of Genesis 6, the text clearly says that human evil had become great. The problem is not allowed to remain somewhere in the heavens. Humanity is accountable. Violence fills the earth. The human heart becomes central to the explanation of judgment. This is important because fascination with angels can sometimes make people overlook the human moral crisis. Genesis does not. The flood narrative is not merely about mysterious beings, it is about a corrupted creation, a broken human world, and the God who judges it. Enoch's presence before that judgment, therefore, becomes a moral contrast, not merely a supernatural mystery. He walked with God. That is what Genesis wants us to remember. Then Noah walks with God. And when the command comes to build the ark, Noah obeys. The genealogy has now become action. For Enoch, walking with God is described without recorded instructions. For Noah, walking with God leads into a detailed act of obedience. Build the ark, bring the family, prepare for what is coming. The idea of walking with God is no longer only a description. In Noah's story, it becomes visible through obedience under warning. Hebrews later brings the same figures together. Enoch by faith, Noah by faith. That New Testament arrangement reinforces the connection already present in Genesis. Enoch trusts God. Noah trusts God. Enoch receives an extraordinary outcome. Noah receives a warning about things not yet seen and acts. Faith does not always look the same. Sometimes it is remembered through a life whose details are almost entirely hidden. Sometimes it is remembered through an enormous construction project visible for years. But the root is the same. Trust in God. And that helps us resist another mistake. We do not need to know everything Enoch did to know what defined him. Modern storytelling often assumes importance requires detail. The Bible repeatedly proves otherwise. Enoch receives fewer verses than many kings who failed, fewer words than many enemies of Israel, fewer recorded actions than countless secondary characters. Yet Hebrews places him among the great examples of faith. Why? Because biblical significance is not measured by word count, nor by fame, nor by visible achievement. Enoch's entire preserved life can almost be summarized in one sentence. He walked with God. But that one sentence became enough to carry his memory across millennia, and his family line continued carrying the biblical story. Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, then judgment. There is a further consequence few retellings follow. The flood does not fulfill every hope attached to Noah. Lamech hopes for relief from the cursed ground. After the flood, Noah emerges into a cleansed world in one sense, but human sin has not disappeared. The story after the ark quickly demonstrates that the deeper human problem remains. The flood judges wickedness. It does not recreate the human heart into moral perfection. Noah himself will experience shame within his family story. His descendants will eventually gather at Babel, human pride will rise again. The biblical narrative keeps moving. This means Enoch's faithfulness cannot be explained by imagining that humanity simply needed a new environment. He lived outside Eden and walked with God. Noah survives the flood and still enters a world where sin remains. The larger biblical problem is deeper than geography, deeper than civilization, deeper than one judgment. Something must happen within humanity's relationship with God. Enoch does not provide the complete answer, but he gives an early sign. A human being can live in trust and communion with God in a fallen world. And God is not limited by the death that dominates that world. Those two truths are small seeds in Genesis. The Bible will develop them far beyond Enoch. Faith, life, death, judgment, deliverance. These themes will follow Abraham, Moses, Israel, the prophets, and eventually the New Testament. But we should not make Enoch consciously carry every later doctrine. His importance is strongest when we allow him to stand where Genesis places him, between Adam and Noah, between fall and flood, between death repeated and judgment approaching. The man in the middle, the man whose story interrupts the genealogy, and the man whose descendants carry the narrative forward after he is gone. This also changes the meaning of his disappearance. At first, God took him feels like the ending of Enoch's story. From the perspective of the genealogy, it is not an ending at all. The line continues. His son remains. His descendants face their own choices. His great-grandson will walk with God. The biblical story never depends on one human being remaining physically present forever. God's purposes move through generations. Enoch leaves. The promise continues. That pattern will appear again and again. Abraham dies. The promise continues through Isaac. Moses dies. Joshua leads Israel onward. David dies. The covenant story continues. Prophets die. Their words remain. The human servant may leave the stage. The biblical story moves forward. Enoch is one of the earliest demonstrations of that pattern. His departure is extraordinary. But God's plan does not stop with him. This may be one reason the untold story of Enoch matters far beyond the question of whether he died. His greatest mystery can make us stare at the moment he leaves. Genesis makes us watch what happens after. Methuselah lives. Lamech hopes. Noah is born. The earth becomes corrupt. Judgment approaches, and once again a man walks with God. At this point, the evidence begins to converge. We know far more about Enoch's place in Scripture than the legends sometimes allow us to notice. He belongs to Seth's line. He is the seventh from Adam. He fathers Methuselah. He walks with God. He is taken by God. Hebrews says he does not see death and presents him as a man of faith. Jude remembers him as a voice associated with judgment. Later Jewish tradition expands him into a great apocalyptic visionary. His descendants lead directly toward Noah and the flood. Those facts create a picture, but they do not answer every question. And now we arrive at the moment where responsible interpretation must do something that mystery storytelling often avoids. We have to sort the evidence. What do we know? What can we reasonably infer? What belongs to later tradition? What remains impossible to establish? Does God took him mean exactly what many Christians casually assume? What does Hebrews allow us to say with confidence? What should we do with Jude? What should we do with the book of Enoch? And after all the speculation is removed, what is the most reasonable conclusion about the man himself? The final mystery is not whether Enoch became an angel. It is not whether he secretly wrote every text attached to his name. It is not whether he will return at the end of history. The deeper question is simpler. After we place Genesis, Hebrews, Jude, genealogy, history, and later tradition side by side, who is the Enoch the Bible actually gives us? After centuries of interpretation, layers of tradition, and countless questions, the story of Enoch finally brings us back to a surprisingly small body of biblical evidence. A genealogy in Genesis, a brief interpretation in Hebrews, a warning in Jude. That is the center. And when those passages are placed together carefully, the figure that emerges is both less elaborate and more powerful than many later retellings suggest. We can now separate three things: what Scripture clearly says, what Scripture allows us to infer, and what later traditions added to the story. That distinction is not meant to reduce the mystery. It allows us to see the real mystery. Because the biblical Enoch does not need to become a heavenly traveler, an angelic being, or the keeper of forbidden knowledge in order to be extraordinary. The Bible already presents him as one of the most unusual human beings in its earliest chapters. So what can we say with confidence? First, Enoch belongs to the line traced through Seth. He is not the Enoch who appears earlier as the son of Cain. Genesis identifies his father as Jared. His son is Methuselah. His descendants continue through Lamech to Noah. Jude later calls him the seventh from Adam. That genealogical identity is secure. Second, Enoch lived 365 years. By the standards of Genesis 5, that is a remarkably short lifespan. The surrounding patriarchs lived for many centuries longer. But Enoch's shorter life is not presented as a tragedy. His record ends differently because the text does not say he died. It says that he walked with God and that God took him. Third, the phrase walked with God is not merely decorative. Genesis repeats it. Later, Noah is described in similar terms. Hebrews interprets Enoch's life through faith and pleasing God. Taken together, these passages strongly suggest that Enoch's defining identity was faithful relationship with God. Not hidden knowledge, not public power, not political influence. Faithfulness. Fourth, Hebrews gives us the clearest canonical explanation of Enoch's disappearance. It says he was taken so that he would not see death. That allows us to affirm something more than merely saying Genesis forgot to record his death. The New Testament understands Enoch's experience as an exception to ordinary human mortality. He does not receive the normal ending that surrounds him in Genesis 5. This is one of the strongest conclusions in the entire story, but it is also where our certainty must stop. The Bible does not tell us exactly how the event happened. It does not describe a vehicle. It does not name witnesses. It does not tell us where Enoch was standing. It does not tell us whether his family saw him leave. It does not describe what happened to his body in physical terms. It does not provide a map of his destination. And it does not tell us what Enoch experienced after God took him. So when people say simply that Enoch never died, that statement is broadly consistent with Hebrews 11 if it means that he did not experience ordinary death before being taken by God. But even that phrase should be handled carefully. Hebrews gives us the theological point. It does not give us every later conclusion people may attach to it. The phrase should not become a doorway through which we smuggle speculation into the text. That is where the second category begins. Reasonable inference. There are things the biblical narrative suggests without spelling them out completely. For example, Enoch's placement inside Genesis 5 is almost certainly meaningful. The repeated formula of death creates a pattern. Enoch breaks it. That interruption highlights his story. The pattern teaches mortality. The exception shows that God is not subject to mortality. Death dominates the human genealogy, but God can act beyond it. That is a reasonable theological conclusion from the structure of the passage. Another reasonable inference concerns Enoch's relationship with the pre-flood world. Genesis places him between Adam and Noah. He belongs to the generations before the flood. His descendant Noah will also walk with God. The wider narrative moves from Cain's murder toward increasing violence and eventually to the corruption described in Genesis 6. That makes Enoch a striking example of faithfulness within a world moving toward judgment. But we should be precise. Genesis does not give us a detailed moral report of Enoch's own neighborhood. It does not say he spent every day confronting violent rulers. It does not describe persecution. So we can speak about his place within the larger pre-flood trajectory without inventing scenes the text does not give us. That difference matters. A powerful story does not require imagined facts to be presented as history. Then there is the third category, later tradition. This is where the story becomes much larger. The Book of Enoch presents an enormous world of heavenly visions, rebellious watchers, judgment, cosmic order, and secret knowledge. Later Jewish traditions develop Enoch even further. Some connect him with heavenly transformation. Some identify him with the exalted figure Metatron. Some Christian interpreters connect him with the two witnesses of Revelation. Some modern theories place him inside elaborate end-times systems. These traditions are important for understanding how Enoch was remembered, but they are not all equally ancient. They are not all equally authoritative, and they do not all come from Genesis. This is the central discipline required when studying Enoch. Do not confuse the history of interpretation with the original biblical account. The distinction is especially important because later traditions are far more detailed. And detail is persuasive. A detailed story feels complete. A brief biblical statement feels unfinished. But completeness of narrative is not the same as historical certainty. A later writer can tell us much more about Enoch while actually giving us less certainty about the historical man. Genesis says less, but what it says carries canonical weight. The Book of Enoch says much more, but its role is different. That does not mean readers should fear it, nor does it mean every Christian tradition must treat it identically. It means we should know what kind of text we are reading. Ancient Jewish apocalyptic literature can illuminate the thought world around Jude and other Second Temple Jewish writings. It can show how Genesis 6 was interpreted by influential ancient communities. It can help explain why Enoch's name became associated with judgment. But it should not silently replace Genesis as the primary source for Enoch's life. The same careful distinction applies to Jude. Jude's reference to Enoch is one of the most important pieces of evidence in this entire discussion. It proves that Enochic tradition had meaningful relevance in the world of the New Testament. It shows that Jude could use a proclamation associated with Enoch to strengthen his warning about judgment. But Jude does not say, therefore, every work attributed to Enoch is scripture, nor does he provide a list of Enochic books, nor does he explain their composition. He uses a particular tradition in a particular argument. The safest conclusion is the narrowest one supported by the text. Jude affirms the proclamation he uses within his own inspired message. That does not automatically settle the canonical status of every Enochic text. This principle protects us from false dilemmas. We do not have to choose between saying the Book of Enoch is worthless and saying it has the same status as Genesis. Those are not the only options. A text can be historically important without being canonical in most traditions. It can preserve ancient interpretation without being the original voice of the patriarch. It can illuminate Jude without becoming the controlling authority over Jude. This is one of the broader lessons Enoch's story teaches about reading the Bible responsibly. Not every ancient source belongs to the same category, and not every unanswered question is an invitation to speak with certainty. The biblical writers themselves often leave mystery intact. Enoch is one of the clearest examples. But there is one more claim that deserves attention. Was Enoch transformed into an angel? The canonical answer is simple. The Bible never says so. Genesis says God took him.
Hebrews says he did not see death. Neither text says he stopped being human and became an angelic being. Later traditions may describe exaltation in more elaborate ways, but those descriptions cannot be imported into Genesis as though they were stated facts. The same applies to Metatron. Whatever significance that figure has within later Jewish mystical traditions, Genesis does not identify Enoch as Metatron. Hebrews does not identify him as Metatron. Jude does not identify him as Metatron. That is a later development. What about the two witnesses of Revelation? Again, Scripture never names them as Enoch and Elijah. The theory has a logic. Both figures are associated with extraordinary departures. Some readers argue they must eventually experience death, but Revelation does not give their names, so the identification remains a theory, possible within certain systems of interpretation, not certain. And what about the Book of Enoch itself? Did the historical Enoch write it? The evidence does not allow us to claim that with confidence. The work known as First Enoch contains material composed and transmitted in periods vastly later than the lifetime assigned to Enoch in Genesis. Ancient authors sometimes wrote in the names of revered figures, a practice often called pseudepigraphy. That does not mean the texts are meaningless or fraudulent in the simplistic modern sense. It means they belong to a literary world where ancient authority could be expressed through a revered ancestral voice. The safest historical conclusion is that First Enoch is an ancient collection written under Enoch's name, rather than a surviving manuscript personally authored by the Genesis patriarch. That conclusion allows us to respect the work without making a claim the evidence cannot sustain. Once these boundaries are established, the real Enoch becomes easier to see. And he is remarkably compelling. He is not powerful because we know everything about him. He is powerful because Scripture remembers the right things. His family, his faith, his walk, his disappearance, and his place in the larger story. Think again about Genesis 5. It measures men in years, hundreds of years, lives so long that modern readers can barely imagine them. But all those years eventually come to the same sentence. And he died. The chapter forces us to confront a reality first announced in Eden. Human beings have become mortal. No number is high enough to escape it. 900 years ends, 960 years ends, 969 years ends. Long life delays death. It does not defeat death. Then comes Enoch. 365 years, much less than the others, and Genesis remembers him differently. This produces one of the most powerful inversions in the chapter. The man who lived fewer years leaves the more unusual legacy. Genesis teaches us that the value of a life cannot be reduced to its length. Enoch's story is not about maximizing years. It is about the direction of those years. He walked with God. The phrase becomes even more powerful when compared with the city associated with the other Enoch. Cain builds a city and names it after his son Enoch. That Enoch becomes connected with something visible, a settlement, a human structure, a name preserved in construction. The Enoch of Seth's line leaves no city in the Genesis account, no monument, no palace, no invention, no land bearing his name. Yet his memory lasts because of something invisible, relationship with God. One Enoch has a city, the other has a testimony. That contrast should not be overstated into a simplistic condemnation of civilization. Genesis itself does not say city building is inherently evil, but as a narrative contrast, it is unforgettable. Human beings naturally preserve memory through monuments. Scripture preserves Enoch through character. He walked with God. This is why the phrase should not be buried beneath speculation about angels. The biblical mystery is not merely that Enoch disappeared.
The deeper mystery is that in a fallen world, someone could still live in such a relationship with God that Scripture chose those words as the summary of his life. Outside Eden, before Sinai, before the temple, before kings, before prophets, as Israel would later know them, before the Bible existed as a collected set of writings, Enoch walked with God. That is the spiritual center of his story, and Hebrews makes the center even clearer. Faith. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. Enoch therefore becomes one of the earliest biblical witnesses that relationship with God is rooted in trust. The institutions come later. The law comes later. Israel comes later. The priesthood comes later. But faith appears near the beginning. Abel acts by faith. Enoch lives by faith. Noah responds by faith. The biblical story is establishing something fundamental. God is not impressed by age alone, not by genealogy alone, not by civilization alone, not by human achievement alone. He responds to faith. This does not mean Enoch was sinless. The Bible never says that. It does not present him as another Adam before the fall. It simply gives him extraordinary commendation. He walked with God. He pleased God. Those claims are strong enough. We do not need to make him perfect. This is another reason the biblical portrait feels trustworthy. Scripture often refuses to idealize its heroes. Noah will survive the flood and still have a painful family story afterward. Abraham will believe and fail. Moses will lead and disobey. David will worship and sin terribly. Peter will confess Christ and deny him. The Bible's heroes are rarely polished into legends. Enoch is different only because we are given so little information. Silence should not be mistaken for sinlessness. It simply means the text has another focus. And that focus is powerful enough. He walked with God. The final theological importance of Enoch appears when we return to death. Genesis 5 sounds like death has the final word. Enoch prevents us from saying that. Not because death disappears. It does not. The next generations still die. The flood itself will become an enormous scene of death and judgment. But Enoch demonstrates that death is not outside God's authority. God can take a man beyond the expected ending. That is not yet the full biblical doctrine of resurrection. We should not force later revelation backward into Genesis. But from the perspective of the entire canon, Enoch's story participates in a larger biblical trajectory. Humanity loses access to the tree of life in Eden. Death spreads through Adam's descendants. Enoch becomes an exception to the ordinary pattern. Elijah later departs in another extraordinary way. The prophets begin speaking of resurrection hope, and the New Testament places resurrection at the center of God's victory over death. Enoch is not the fulfillment of that story. He is an early sign that death has never been sovereign over God. That is a more careful and more meaningful conclusion than turning him into proof for every later end times theory. He is a sign, an exception, a witness, not the entire doctrine. His story also teaches us something about judgment. Jude remembers Enoch as a voice declaring that ungodliness will not continue forever without accountability. This theme fits the world around him. Enoch stands before Noah. Noah stands before the flood. The pre-flood narrative moves toward judgment. Later Enochic tradition expands that connection dramatically. But even without those expansions, the canonical pattern is clear. Walking with God and living in ungodliness lead in different directions. Genesis does not always show those consequences immediately. Sometimes generations pass. But judgment remains part of the story. This is why Enoch cannot be reduced to a comforting devotional figure. His New Testament legacy includes warning. Faith and judgment stand together. Hebrews asks, "Do you trust God?" Jude asks, Do you live as though God will judge evil Enoch's memory? Serves both questions, and that balance is important. A documentary about Enoch can easily become fascinated with secret knowledge, but the biblical texts keep redirecting us towards something more personal: faith, conduct, accountability, relationship with God. That may be the greatest irony of his entire legacy. For centuries, people have searched Enoch for secrets, yet the clearest message of his canonical story is not secret at all. Walk with God. Trust Him. Live in a way that pleases Him. Know that death is not beyond His authority. Know that ungodliness will not remain unanswered forever. Everything else must be held with the level of certainty the evidence deserves. This is also why Enoch's story should change how we read biblical mysteries in general. Mystery does not mean every theory is equally valid. Silence does not mean anything can be inserted. Ancient tradition does not automatically equal Scripture. And careful interpretation does not destroy wonder. It protects it. When we remove exaggerated claims, Enoch does not become less mysterious. He becomes more mysterious in the right way. A human being in the earliest generations of the world, a descendant of Adam, a father of Methuselah, a forefather of Noah, a man who walks with God for centuries, and then disappears because God takes him. The Bible gives no funeral, no grave, no ordinary death. Hebrews confirms the exception. Then Scripture moves on. There is no need to invent a hidden conspiracy, no need to create a secret biography, no need to pretend certainty about heavenly journeys the canonical text never describes. The mystery is already present, and perhaps that is exactly how Scripture intends us to leave it, not with every question solved, but with the central truth clarified. Enoch was not remembered because he mastered death. God did. Enoch was not remembered because he found heaven. God took him. Enoch was not remembered first because of secret knowledge. He was remembered because he walked with God. The subject of the story is not ultimately Enoch's greatness. It is God's sovereignty over life, over death, over judgment, and over the relationship He establishes with those who seek Him. That is why Hebrews places Enoch among the people of faith rather than among the great political figures of history. He has no throne, no army, no empire, no book of the canonical Bible bearing his name, yet his testimony survives. And maybe that is the most surprising legacy of all. The first chapters of Genesis are filled with people trying to establish their place in the world. Cain builds a city. Later generations create technology and culture. After the flood, humanity will eventually build Babel and seek to make a name for itself. Again and again, human beings build something so they will not be forgotten. Enoch builds no such monument in the text. He does not need one. God remembers his walk, and Scripture remembers it too. For thousands of years, readers have asked what Enoch saw in heaven. Genesis asks us to notice what God saw in Enoch: faith, a life pleasing to Him, a man walking with Him. Perhaps that is the question the story finally turns back on us. Not, do we understand every mystery surrounding Enoch, but what would our own lives be remembered for? Not everyone receives Enoch's extraordinary ending. Scripture never promises that. Most of the faithful die. Hebrews itself makes that clear. The lesson is not to expect Enoch's removal. The lesson is to imitate his faith. That distinction allows the application to remain biblical. His fate was exceptional. His faithfulness is exemplary. And those two things should never be confused. If you have followed this story all the way from the genealogies of Adam to the writings associated with Enoch's name, then perhaps the most important discovery is that the untold part was never a secret chapter hidden from the Bible. It was the connection between details already in front of us. Two Enochs, two family lines, a genealogy filled with death, a man who breaks the pattern, a son named Methuselah, a descendant named Noah, a phrase repeated across generations, walked with God. A New Testament interpretation built around faith, a later warning built around judgment, and an enormous tradition that grew from the silence between a few ancient sentences. Once those pieces are placed together, Enoch no longer looks like an isolated curiosity. He belongs exactly where Genesis places him, between Eden and the flood, between Adam and Noah, between the entrance of death and a reminder that God remains sovereign over it. And that is why his tiny biblical biography has survived with such enormous force. The Bible gives us only a few verses, but those verses contain a life, a mystery, a warning, and a hope. The traditions surrounding Enoch may continue to fascinate readers. The questions may continue. What did he see? Where exactly was he taken? How much of the later tradition preserves older memories? How should particular ancient texts be understood? Some of those questions may never receive complete answers, and Scripture does not apologize for that. It leaves Enoch where faith and mystery meet. A man known not for how much he revealed to us, but for how closely he walked with God. If this series has helped you see how much can be hidden in the connections between familiar passages, tell us which biblical figure should receive the next untold story. Perhaps Melchizedek. Perhaps Methuselah. Perhaps the mysterious sons of God in Genesis 6. Or perhaps another figure whose few verses opened questions that have lasted for centuries. Subscribe if you want to continue exploring these stories with the biblical text at the center, separating what Scripture says from what history, tradition, and later interpretation added around it. And as we leave Enoch behind, remember the contrast Genesis gives us. Most of the men in his chapter are remembered by the number of years they lived. Enoch is remembered differently. Genesis remembers generations by how long they lived. Enoch is remembered by how closely he walked with God.